The Reptile. 1. The solicitor was an affable, vague little man, with an incongruously deep voice. The dust of his office might have settled in his hair, and turned his skin a faint yellow, but it had not affected his vocal cords. He intoned legal phrases as though they were lines from the Psalms. If he were a regular churchgoer, thought Harry Spaulding, he must be a great asset to the choir or congregation. And I, Charles Edward Spaulding, he half sang, half recited in his rich bass, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath all that I possess to my brother, Harry George Spaulding of His Majesty's Grenadier Guards, such possessions to include such moneys as I may have at the time of my death, and all my personal shareholdings and effects, such to include the cottage which I own in the village of Clagmore in Cornwall, England, known as Larkrise. Harry glanced at Valerie, seated beside him. She had been staring gravely at the solicitor, but now she turned her head slightly and smiled. It was a smile in which he read a shared amusement, and at the same time her sympathy for what lay behind the histrionic voice and the plodding words, sympathy for Harry's sense of loss, the still incredible fact of his brother's death, and love. There was love in her smile too. It blazed in the musty room and brought light into the place. She was so vivid and so alive that it was impossible to feel too gloomy, impossible almost, to concentrate on the solicitor's self-indulgent speech. "Well, there we are then," said Mr. Beeding of Beeding, Peregrine, and Beeding. He nodded with the satisfaction of one who has sung a splendid descant, and finished absolutely in tune. Dated the 28th of August 1901, nearly a year ago, duly witnessed, all in order. All very simple, quite straightforward, that is. He chuckled resonantly and invited them to join him in his flippancy. "If you are Harry George Spaulding of His Majesty's Grenadier Guards." "I take it you are?" Harry donated the expected smile. "On temporary leave of absence, to settle your brother's affairs." "Quite. Well then it all goes to you. Don't expect too much though. Your brother was not by any means a rich man." Harry thought ruefully that none of the Spauldings had ever distinguished themselves in business or in speculation. It did not worry him. Neither he nor Charles had ever counted on inheriting any great wealth from the other. "His shareholdings," said Mr. Beeding, with a politely derogatory glance at a list pinned to the will, "were virtually worthless, but there's always the cottage." "Yes, there's the cottage. Mind you, I've never seen it myself. I've no idea what it's like, none at all. He had very simple tastes, your brother, you know. Lived very frugally, if I may say so." Valerie said quietly, "Our tastes are simple too." The solicitor had looked at her in sharp, covert appraisal a couple of times since she entered the room with Harry. Now he took the plunge and asked, "Are you thinking of living there too, Miss, "Yes. Until I'm recalled, that is," said Harry. "Both of you?" said Mr. Beeding. Yes. I see." He didn't see at all. Harry, watching the droop of that disapproving lower lip, could not refrain from turning the screw just a fraction more. He said, "If you mean we aren't married." "That is true, sir." The solicitor's face sagged still farther. The 20th century was hardly begun, but Mr. Beeding obviously had the direst doubts about it. "Young people today." "However," said Harry, taking out his watch and looking at it, "that will be remedied in exactly 3 hours and 15 minutes from now." The solicitor beamed. "Well, how nice, how delightful. May I be the first to, well, probably not the first, if your arrangements are so far advanced, but let me anyway." Thank you," said Valerie. "But you do realize that this cottage has only 2 rooms, a bedroom and a sitting room. And from the details I have," he rustled through the sheaf of papers on his desk, "I would venture the opinion that the conveniences aren't really, He waved a sheet of paper and put it down again. "Were you thinking of making it a permanent home?" Harry had no wish to tell this withered little husk of a man the story of his life and problems. Further, he had no wish to imply that his brother's death had solved one of those problems. The shock of the loss was greater than any advantage that could possibly accrue. And yet it was true that the cottage came as a godsend at just this moment in time. His army pay was no fortune, and although Valerie had sworn that she did not care where or how she lived so long as she could be his wife, There had been obvious practical difficulties. Now at least he could offer her a home, however small. Later they might be able to satisfy grander ambitions, but here and now the cottage would have to do. He said, "We'd like to move in tomorrow." "Tomorrow? We can catch the morning train." "Well." The solicitor's wavering opinion of them took another downward plunge. He lived in a world of caution and double caution, of surveyors and careful investigations, of slow movement, because fast movement often caused one to trip over an unforeseen obstacle. Even as a young man it was unlikely that Mr. Beeding had ever been impetuous, and in his present profession there was no doubt that impetuosity was the gravest of all sins. "You'd better have the key then," he said reluctantly. He dug into a drawer of his desk, and took out a small leather pouch. Then he fussed through the papers before him. Legally, of course, there are one or two formalities to be cleared up. Certain documents. Let's see, the deeds are here. I'll have to make application for. Strictly speaking, you ought not to move in at once, but I'm sure that in the circumstances, nobody will. He stood up, handed over the key, and nodded with a benevolence which was genuine in spite of his reservations. "And if there's anything else I can do, or anything you want to ask—" "There is one thing, sir. That is, have you any idea how my brother died?" Mr. Beeding looked upset. The help he had offered was general rather than personal, and he had not really expected to be taken up on it anyway. "Why? When I last saw him, he was as fit as I am. The report said it was, heart failure. He was as strong as an ox. Even the heart of an ox has been known to fail." Mr. Beeding grinned, then wiped the grin off his face, and assumed an expression of grave detachment. "It is of course not my province, however. May I suggest an early visit to his physician to ascertain the facts? And now," he had decided that enough was enough. "Once more my congratulations to you both." They shook hands and left. When they were outside, Valerie took a deep breath of fresh air. "I was afraid I was going to sneeze. All those ancient files crumbling to pieces, and that tickling sort of smell. I'm sure I was breathing nothing but decayed paper and cardboard." He took her arm and hailed a hansom. "The air in Cornwall will be a lot better." Valerie nodded eagerly. Her grey eyes sparkled, and her lips parted as she looked up at him. "Lacrise," she said, and then tried the word over again as though savouring it on her tongue. "Lacrise. It does sound pretty, doesn't it? Clagmore Heath doesn't sound quite so appetizing." "We'll love it," she said firmly. They drove away. Harry put her down at the house of her aunt, where she was staying before the wedding. The aunt, like Mr. Beeding, didn't approve of modern ways of doing things, and had been appalled by Valerie's decision to accompany Harry to the solicitor's on her wedding morning. Now there was only a brief time left before the ceremony, but to both Harry and Valerie it was far too long. The best man was a fellow officer. Harry had hoped that his brother would be standing beside him on this great occasion, but fate had decreed that Charles should never even meet Valerie. The thought weighed on Harry's mind for a few moments, and again he wondered how Charles could possibly have died so suddenly, without warning, without apparent reason. Charles, so few years older than himself, and so rational and civilized in his ways. And then Valerie came into the church, and he put every other thought aside. They spent the night at a London hotel. It was in a quiet street in Bloomsbury, and they felt very far away from anyone they knew, and from the whole noisy, busy world, and very close together. Valerie's shy grace was transformed into frank, responsive passion. In the morning Harry was almost tempted to suggest that they stay here for another week or so. Their room had become a place of magic, and they were reluctant to give it up. But the cottage was waiting for them, and quite apart from the expense of staying on in London, there was the bustle and clamour of the daytime hours. The distant countryside would be more rewarding, more relaxing. As the train made its way out of London and settled to the long journey down into the West Country, Harry knew the decision had been the right one. Valerie had brought a magazine to read on the train, but when the houses fell away and the green fields began to flow alongside the track, she let the periodical fall to her lap and stared out of the window. A gentle half-smile plucked occasionally at her lips, and every now and then she glanced at her husband. There was a deep, unspoken communion between them. And he sensed how happy she was to be leaving the city and yielding herself up to the hills and fields, no matter how lonely they might be. Now they had each other, neither of them could ever know loneliness again. As the train roared over the Saltash Bridge, with the Tamar twisting below, Valerie yawned and stretched like a cat. As though to echo her, a plaintive mewing came from the basket on the seat beside her. Valerie patted the top of the basket. Nearly there. Her avowed reason for bringing Katie the cat with her had been that they might have to face a plague of mice or rats, since the cottage had been empty for quite a little while. But even if it could have been proved that there were no vermin in the place, Harry suspected that Katie would nevertheless have accompanied them. She had been Valerie's pet for over a year, and although there was no reason to suspect Valerie's aunt of planning any cruelty towards the animal once the girl had gone, she would not have given it the attention and affection to which it was accustomed. So Katie was heading for Cornish rats and mice, or, in their absence, for regular helpings of Cornish cream. Harry wondered what Valerie would have said if he had forbidden her to bring the cat. He looked across the compartment at her profile as she contemplated the landscape, a profile gentle yet confident, yielding yet in its own way sweetly determined. Not that he would have wanted to ban the cat. As an officer, he had already learnt the folly of issuing unnecessary orders. It was unthinkable, he thought dreamily, that he and Valerie should ever fail to see eye to eye on everything. The train slowed. At the junction, they had to change to a small, grubby little coach, hauled by a puffing engine, which Trevithick would surely have recognized as a near relative of his own device. Although bathed in sunshine, the countryside now looked alien and forbidding. There were few roads, and those that curled in close to the railway were not inviting. They did not stay long, but trailed away up a gaunt hillside, as though to lead the unwary traveller towards the haunts of old Celtic gods. The noisy, smoky engine was an intruder. The railway had cut a swath through the land, but it was allowed here only on the understanding that it remained small and unobtrusive, creeping along at a snail's pace, and not whistling or letting off steam too arrogantly. It jolted to a halt beside a brief stretch of wooden platform, with a hut made of rough planks. A sign announced that this was Clagmore Heath. Steam from the engines sighed and drifted over a narrow, rock-choked stream as Harry and Valerie got out. As soon as Harry had closed the compartment door, the tiny train puffed on its way. One felt that it might vanish into the sombre moors and never be seen again. It seemed somehow improbable that at the end of the line there was a perfectly ordinary terminus and an ordinary town filled with ordinary people. Harry went into the hut. One side had been partitioned off, and there was a window in the wall to serve as a ticket office. The window was covered by a wooden shutter at the moment. Harry knocked on it and knocked again, but there was no reply. "Anyone there?" His voice resonated in the boards and died away. Outside, on the far side of the track, a bird began to sing, but that was his only answer. Valerie went to the end of the platform and looked along the road leading away from the station. It was little more than a lane. Like so many of the roads they had seen during the last part of their journey, it curled secretively round a hill and disappeared. Beyond that hump of land, presumably, was the village. "Looks like we're out of luck," said Harry. The stillness was somehow alive with sounds just beyond the range of hearing. The grass stirred, tiny creatures rustled below the boarding of the platform, and the rails seemed still to be singing with the vibration of the train. Harry put his arm round Valerie's shoulders and nodded towards the dusty lane. "I'm afraid it means a walk, darling. Is it far, do you think?" He took a map from his grip and unfolded it. The twisting route of the lane was clear enough. "A couple of miles," he said. "Do you think you can manage?" "But the luggage?" Harry took their cases and carried them into a shadowy corner of the bleak waiting room. He was not happy at the idea of them standing here, neglected and unguarded, but would have been even less happy carrying them 2 miles or so into the village. "We'll send for it when we get there," he said resolutely. "All right, but—" Valerie picked up the cat basket. "I'm not leaving Katie behind." Harry took the basket from her and led the way down the slope at the end of the platform. Along the lane nobody stirred. There was no sign of anyone working in the fields, and no wagon or trap passed them on the way. Beyond the hill there was another slope, concealing the eventual destination of the lane. A wayside cross with its strange wheel head looked pagan rather than Christian. A faint breeze sighed through its blank eyes. Behind it, a hump on the crown of the hill had the squat menace of a Neolithic tomb, a tomb from which, in the right conditions, in moonlight and shifting cloud, something old and sinister might still rise from the dead. Harry shivered. Valerie glanced at him. He did not know whether she had communicated her own uneasiness to him, or whether he had been the first to respond to this chill atmosphere. It was absurd. He was a soldier, not an imaginative, feebly melodramatic poet. The sun was warm on his brow, and it was ridiculous that he should at the same time feel cold seeping into his bones. As they turned yet another bend, the sun in the west struck a brilliant spark of light from something that shone gold against the sky. It was the weather vane on a church tower less than a quarter of a mile ahead of them. Valerie sighed with relief. At last. The lane, edging along the hillside, seemed in a hurry now. It tilted sharply downwards and ran into the village. The church dominated the little huddle of buildings. Its square buttressed tower was set firmly on a little knoll, and sloping away from it was a graveyard dark with heavy granite headstones. Harry's pace slowed. "Welcome to Clagmore," he said, and came to a stop by the heaped uneven stones of the graveyard wall. Valerie stood beside him and touched his hand. "Darling," she said quietly. He looked over the wall. Some of the older headstones were tilting as though about to give up and collapse from sheer weariness. The weight of the years thrust the tombs down, or cracked the surrounds. A new grave was like a livid sore in the grey and green solemnity of the churchyard. A new grave. The earth was still like raw flesh, no stone had yet been set in place. The ground was not yet settled. The surface of the earth had not yet hardened sufficiently over Charles Spaulding. Harry looked at Valerie. There was no need for words. She nodded slightly. He walked along the wall to a small rusty gate. It shrieked as he opened it and walked in. Flints on the path rustled beneath his feet. He had to walk round a huddle of gravestones all bearing the name of one family, and then among the old Cornish names, he found the still unnamed newcomer. Here was his brother's resting place. It still seemed unbelievable. His mind refused to accept it. He stared at the shape outlined in the ground, and could not persuade himself that Charles lay beneath it. How had he died? From now on this district was to be his home. Here he was to spend his honeymoon, and perhaps many years of his life with Valerie. But they would not, could not settle, until he knew what had stricken Charles down in the full flush of his life. He went back to Valerie. They descended the last stretch of the lane, and arrived opposite an inn with a creaking faded sign. The sun was going down but still glowed warmly in the treetops and along the erratic roofs of the village. From the open windows of the inn came a leisurely buzz of voices. "I'll ask in there where the cottage is," said Harry. "And perhaps I can get some help with the luggage. I'll sit out here." Valerie turned her face up towards the sun, as though to catch its last rays and not waste any of its warmth. "Don't talk to any strange men." She looked quizzically across the patch of green and the small pond round which the houses clustered. Somewhere a dog barked, and in its basket the cat produced a brisk, defiant little squawk. Otherwise there was no sound, no movement. "Strange men?" Valerie echoed. Harry laughed. He pushed open the door to the bar and went in. The room had a low ceiling, which had probably been dark to start with, and now was almost black with years of tobacco fumes. The walls were a mottled ochre, and the darkness of the interior was intensified by the high-backed oak settles on either side of the fireplace and set at an angle from the windows. Harry blinked, trying to adjust his eyes to the cool shadows. He got a face in focus. It was the seamed, weather-beaten face of an old man in the chimney corner, and it swam out of the uncertainty because it had been touched momentarily by sunlight striking at an angle through the far window. Then it was gone. The old man pushed himself to his feet and tottered past Harry, out into the open. The comforting buzz of voices had died. There was utter silence. The other occupants of the bar might almost have been holding their breath to tantalize him. Harry said, "I wonder if—" It was as though he had given a signal. Before he could say another word, all the men in the bar got to their feet and made for the door. Their still hazy shapes came towards him, so that he had to step aside. Nobody looked at him, nodded, or spoke. "Look," said Harry, bewildered. "I only wanted to— Please, look here, But it was no good. They had all gone. The bar took on sharper outlines as he got used to the dim light, and he saw that it was empty now. 2. The landlord appeared from a doorway behind the bar. He was a broad man with heavy shoulders, and he left little space on either side. Harry had a glimpse of a cozy little room beyond, and then the landlord had planted both hands on the counter and was looking over it incredulously. What the devil? He scanned the floor and walls, as though in search of hidden trapdoors and panels. Then he saw Harry, still only a few steps inside the main door. "What have you done with them?" "I'm sorry, You've driven them all away." After the long journey down, and the sight of the deserted station, and then the dusty walk, and now this frigid reception, Harry had had more than enough. He stiffened, and a military crackle came into his tone. "I've done nothing to drive anyone away. I came to this inn expecting hospitality. I'm a complete stranger here." The landlord nodded wryly. "That's it. You're a stranger. They don't think much on strangers. They don't even like me all that much, and I've been here nigh on 3 years. He leaned forward, studying Harry. His face was as seamed as that of the old man who had led the flight from the bar. But there was an indescribable difference. The lines were not those of local weather, and not of suspicion and mistrust, but of a wider, rougher experience. "Here," he said in a gruff but not unfriendly tone. "Turn round. Into the light a bit. You remind me of someone. I've got it. Mr. Spaulding." "That's hardly surprising," said Harry. "That's who I am. The Spaulding that died, I mean. Are you a relative?" "I'm his brother." "Are you, now—" The broad man hesitated, then pushed up the counter flap and came through. He put out his hand. "Then I'm very pleased to meet you, Mr. Spaulding." "Tom Bailey, that's me." They shook hands. The man's grip was firm and, thought Harry, could be bone-crushing. He would sooner have the fellow as a friend than an enemy. He said, "I'm sorry I frightened your business away." "Oh, they'll be back." Tom Bailey cleared his throat and added apologetically, "As soon as you're gone, that is." "In that case, I'd better go and— Now you're here, you'd better have a drink." The landlord turned back to the bar and took down a pewter tankard. He filled it from a barrel tilted at the end of the counter. "Here's our best stuff. See what you think of it." Harry looked dubiously at the foaming beer. He was thirsty, certainly, but he didn't want to keep Valerie waiting outside too long, and he didn't think he was destined to get much help here. "I'd better not stay." "No." Tom Bailey laughed, harshly yet appreciatively. "Have your drink, then go. Don't take too long, I need my regulars and their money." He waited until Harry had taken a long grateful swig at the cool bitter, then said in a more sympathetic tone, "Sad business that, about your brother. You've come about the cottage, I suppose?" "Yes." "Won't fetch much, you know. Not round here." "I'm not going to sell it." The oddly remote, far-seeing eyes widened suddenly, and became sharp. "Going to live there? Is there any reason why I shouldn't?" "Not that I know of," said Tom slowly. "But if I was you, I'd sell it." "Sell and get out? Why?" "My brother lived there. And died there." Again Harry thought of the long journey here, and the high hopes they had cherished. Everything had seemed so simple. He wasn't going to have it complicated by dull, backward, inhospitable yokels. He said, "It's going to be our home. We intend to make—" "We? You're not alone, then?" He found it hard, and then deliciously strange, to say the words. "My wife is with me." "Is she, now?" The words dropped into the room like the slow, maddening drip of a tap. And then, as though the tap had been turned abruptly off, there was a silence in which one waited waited for the drip to resume or for a new sound to take its place. For something. Harry broke the silence. "Can you direct me to the cottage? That's why I came in here in the first place." He finished his drink and waited. Well, now. The landlord's cheerfulness was a professional trick, meaning nothing and not disguising his unease. "You'll find it easy enough. Up the street, left at the top, then over the moor. About 2 miles. Another 2 miles?" Harry's heart sank. He hated to think that this was the life into which he had so quickly led Valerie. She ought to have been driven up to a mansion in a splendid carriage, or installed in a luxurious townhouse with no cares and no need to trudge for miles over a hostile countryside. "I suppose there's no chance of getting any transport? Up there? Not a hope, not even a farm cart?" "We could do with one to pick up our luggage from the station, for that matter. I'd pay. You wouldn't get a farmer to go near the place, no matter what you paid." Tom took the empty tankard and began to wash it below the bar. "I'm afraid you'll be having to walk it, and if I was in your shoes, I'd like to get there before it got too dark." A dozen questions trembled on Harry's tongue. They would have to wait. The first essential was to get settled in. After that, he would explore the neighborhood and dig out the truth. He was not a man for evasions. He was still a young man, but he had already had some years of experience in tight corners and strange situations, and knew that when one struck, one must strike decisively. If there was an interrogation to be carried out, one must be quite sure of the line of questioning, and what it was intended to elicit. When he was ready, he would waste neither time nor words. He went out and found Valerie sitting tranquilly on the bench at the edge of the village green. She was lost in contemplation, and he knew that in her own thoughtful, responsive way she was taking in the atmosphere of the place, touched by what was beautiful and puzzled by the dark uncertainties that lay as thickly across the rooftops as the shadows lay down the lane and across the pond. "I found out where the cottage is," he said, "and a lot more." She got up, smiling, and looked around. "But," he said, "I'm afraid we're going to have to keep walking." He picked up the cat basket, and they moved off. The moors grew even darker and more inhospitable than the hollow in which the village sheltered. Only an occasional rosy tinge echoed the dying sun. The rock outcrops were savage and unyielding, and the side away from the sun was no more than a jagged blackness. Stunted bushes humped their shoulders out of grass and trailing undergrowth which had lost all color in the advancing evening. Harry felt that they were chasing the sun, that they ought to break into a sprint and try to catch it before it was utterly lost beyond the farthest horizon. He quickened his pace, and after a little wince of protest, Valerie fell into step. They reached the crown of a hill and looked down beyond it. At last! The cottage was snug and secure below a windbreak of trees. A splash of color in front of it marked the pattern of a small garden. When they got closer, they might find that it had been left untended for a while, but from here it was a gay, invigorating splash in the twilight. "There it is, darling," said Harry. "The Spaulding home for some years to come. What do you think?" "It's what I've always dreamed of." He was sure that she must have dreamed of something much grander. But she had said it because he needed her to say it, and knowing her, he knew also that she was in a matter of seconds coming to believe it. The picture was an enchanting one. They would be happy here, whatever the cottage's limitations. He kissed her, and she laughed gently against his lips. Then he took her by the hand, and they went towards the cottage, beginning to hurry until they were very nearly running, like two excited children, unable to restrain their enthusiasm. And why restrain it? They both felt eager and loving and ready to be captured by the cottage. Roses drooped above the doorway and blossomed in a luxuriant yellow and crimson haze below the front of the house. The paint on the front door was dry and peeling, but there was a dumpy self-assurance about the small building as a whole that was welcome. It offered a warmer greeting than the bar of the inn had done, and although it was isolated on the edge of a field, it looked cozier than the cramped houses of the village had done. Roses round the door, Harry marveled, and a brand new wife. What more could a man want? He took the key from his pocket and unlocked the door. When he pushed, there was a second of resistance, then the door squeaked and opened before them. Valerie stepped forward. Before she could cross the threshold, Harry swept her up in his arms and strode in. "Home," he said triumphantly as he set her down. Light from the doorway and the windows seeped into the sitting room. It cast strange shadows. The room and its furniture were oddly distorted. Nothing seemed to be the right way up. The proportions were all wrong, the balance of the place somehow unsteady. They stood stock still and waited for sense to be established out of the chaos. But the chaos remained. The room was in a shambles. It had been wantonly wrecked. A table had been overturned, and two of its legs hammered until they twisted askew. Chairs were smashed and warped. Curtains had been ripped from the windows. A tablecloth was torn to shreds. The doors of a wall cupboard had been torn from their hinges, and broken crockery crunched underfoot as Harry took a step forward. Against the far wall was a stove. Its door was open, and coal spilled out across the carpet in a black, uneven stain. Valerie moved past him. She tried to pick her way, but still there was a snapping and splintering as she approached the door leading into the kitchen. Harry followed her and stood by her shoulder. Crockery had been smashed in the sink. A kettle lay on its side, and had obviously been stamped on. Narrow stairs led up in a tight curve, opening directly into a small bedroom. Linen had been pulled from a chest of drawers and ripped into long shreds. Harry inspected it without advancing into the room, and edged his way cautiously back to ground level. He and Valerie looked at each other. In the dim light he saw tears glimmering in her eyes. "Darling." He took her in his arms and felt her tighten against him, almost as she had tightened when they made love. But now it was a despairing anger rather than love. "I'm sorry," he said as her cheek pressed against his. "I'm so sorry." He shook suddenly with a blind fury. Someone had come in and smashed everything that came to hand. In an answering rage he would have liked to get his hands on them, to smash and destroy just as they had smashed and destroyed. The pointless viciousness of it made him sick and at the same time savage. Valerie pulled away from him. He wanted to apologize, to beg her forgiveness for offering her such a beginning to their married life. It was not his fault, but somehow he ought to have been able to avert it. He ought to have been more patient, explored the ground before coming here. He could hear from a great distance the sage voice of Mr. Beeding telling him that he had rushed into things, that he ought to have taken his time. But his leave would not last forever. He must rejoin his brigade. There wasn't a lot of time in which to do a lot of things. Valerie said, "Come on." She was pushing back the sleeves of her dress as though it meant nothing more to her than an old stained apron. "Our home needs a little cleaning up." He wanted to tell her that she was wonderful, and that he loved her, and would always love her. But she swept past him in a mood of grim practicality, and flung herself into a frenzy of activity. He threw his jacket to one side and joined her. Under the sink was a can of paraffin which had escaped the attention of the intruders. Valerie found an oil lamp overturned in the sitting room, a long trickle of oil soaking into the carpet. The lamp glass was mercifully not broken. They set up the light on the draining board in the kitchen and, starting there, worked their way systematically back into the sitting room. Valerie cleaned while Harry dragged debris out of her way and did what he could to repair essential pieces of furniture. At the end of an hour he said, "I think I've cleared the way for you. Do you mind if I go down to the inn?" Valerie, on her knees with a bowl of water and a scrubbing brush, glanced up at him. "You're taking to drink already? So soon in our married life? I want to get to the bottom of this and let them know who they're dealing with from now on. Darling, you won't stir up too much trouble?" "Stir it up?" he exploded, waving round the room. It looked better now than it had done earlier, but still bore grim and grimy traces of the devastation. "I didn't start this, but I'm the one who's going to finish it." She put up her lips to his. "Take care, my love. You're very valuable to me." Harry strode away from the cottage. The evening was cool, but he was in a sweat of rage. The distance to the village meant nothing. He strode on with no awareness of time or distance. He was in no danger of losing his way. His sense of direction was sharpened by his need to get to grips with the vandals who had trampled over his property. Night closed in on the moors, and he walked unseeing but with a sure instinct. His steady pace did not alter when flickering lights through curtained windows told him that he was on the outskirts of the village. The windows of the inn were brighter than most. From several yards away the babble was louder and more cheerful than it had been earlier. The cheerfulness ebbed as he flung open the door and marched in. Like a tide rushing away down the shingle, it died away to a murmur. And then there was the same hostile silence which had greeted him that first time. But this time the lights were on. Oil lamps were set in ornamental holders round the walls, casting a clear, faintly greenish brightness over the wary faces in the bar. Harry looked from one face to another. They were closed, unyielding. They met his stare with blank lack of recognition, not even admitting that he was a fellow human being. Harry said, "Somebody has deliberately wrecked my brother's cottage." "My cottage?" He waited. They did not look away, and they did not flinch. "I know I'm a stranger here," he said slowly and deliberately, "and I'm not asking to be given any spectacular welcome. But I do expect to be allowed to prove myself before being judged an enemy. If any of you had any quarrel with my late brother and want to take it out on me, let him come right out and say so. If there are any grudges, let them be settled in a way we all understand." Still the sly eyes in the weathered faces were contemptuous in their indifference. Harry kept his voice down, but the challenge forced itself out with a menace which none could mistake. "Well, which of you did it?" Tom Bailey appeared from the parlour. If he sensed the atmosphere he did not let on. He was as uncommunicative on this score as the most dour of his customers. "Hello there, Mr. Spaulding. I've got your luggage in the back there. Old Garnsey picked it up for you from the station." He nodded at a hunched elderly man who sat stooped under the chimney-piece. "I expect you'd be thinking of standing him a pint for his trouble, wouldn't you?" Without waiting for an answer, he reached up for a tankard and began to fill it. "And I know old Garnsey won't say no." The head jabbed up from between the sunken shoulders. Garnsey sucked his lips in, seemed to push himself towards Harry without moving from his seat, and said in a blurring, slurred voice, "None of us touched your cottage, mister." "Then who did?" "I don't know who did, mister. I'm only telling you it were none of us. And I don't drink with people as accuses me of things I haven't done." Now he moved. He got up, keeping his head down so that he would not collide with the heavy beam across the fireplace, and plodded towards the door. Without a word his cronies downed what was left of their drinks and followed. Harry turned towards the bar, where Tom Bailey was already wagging his head. "Looks like you've emptied my bar again. You'd better buy yourself a drink before you drive me out of business." Harry needed a drink. He offered one to Tom, who accepted politely, but showed no sign of unbending too far. Harry explained what had brought him back so soon, and tried to analyze the landlord's expression. It was no good. Tom Bailey might have been in the district for only a few years, but he had acquired the secretive ways of the villagers already. No, he couldn't imagine who could have done such a thing. Some tramps or vagabonds, most likely. There wasn't any point in trying to follow it up, in his opinion. Whoever did it must be over into the next county, well on his way, long ago. And it didn't do, if you asked him, to go saying too much to the locals. They didn't take kindly to that sort of talk. "You mean," said Harry indignantly, "I just have to pretend nothing has happened, and tell my wife there's nothing to be done, and she's not to worry, and then go off and leave her on her own for months on end? If you can't put your finger on it," Tom shrugged. "There ain't much point in going on about it, is there?" His shrug was unconvincing. Harry felt that the landlord sympathized with him, but had one eye on his profits. It was hard to blame him. In a small inn like this, it was the regulars who kept the place prosperous round the year. You didn't offend your locals by teaming up with troublesome strangers. Not if you wanted to stay in business. All the same, Harry bit back a dozen remarks, all of them at best provocative and at worst inflammatory. With an effort he switched the conversation. "We'll need to lay in some food. I suppose there's a village store?" "There's a shop," conceded Tom, relieved at the change of subject. "What about tonight and the morning, though? You brought anything down from London with you?" "I'm afraid we didn't think. You can't live on fresh air, not even for 24 hours. Look, I've got a good store of provisions in the back. We'll make you up a bundle, and I'll get my old cart out for you. Should take your luggage all right." He glanced dubiously at Harry's trim figure. You can handle a horse. An old cart horse? I think so. Can't do you much damage. He hasn't got no energy left in him. And I'll lend you a lantern. Thanks. But I'm not afraid of the dark. Nor am I, said Tom. Only of what it conceals. Before Harry could question him, he turned and went back through the parlor, calling Harry to follow him. 3. The sound of wood and coals spluttering and occasionally shifting in the stove was comforting. As Valerie carried things to and from the kitchen, she felt gusts of warmth breathing up from the metal and spreading out through the room. The oil lamp cast a cheerful light from the table, whose legs had been temporarily but efficiently secured by Harry before he left. Wherever Valerie looked, she found something wrong or makeshift. The tattered curtains were bunched and pinned awkwardly together so that they would not collapse. On the rugs, there were smudges, which would not come out. 2 chairs had been mutilated beyond repair, and were now stacked in an ugly heap in the corner. But in spite of everything, the room was beginning to look cozy. The lamplight softened the harsher realities of the damage, and the cat, drowsily licking itself in a basket close to the stove, was doing its share in providing a homely atmosphere. She had reason to be proud of the kitchen too. She had sorted out unbroken cups from the debris and hung them back on their hooks. Saucers and plates were neatly stacked on the shelves. 1 kettle had been dented beyond repair, but she found another, a heavy, cumbersome black kettle which had been too tough to be destroyed. Her clothes were grimy, and she wouldn't be able to change into anything fresh until their luggage arrived. But she felt triumphant. She had already restored a semblance of order to her home, and the effort made her feel possessive towards it. Home. It was a good word, an inspiriting word. Valerie took the black kettle and opened the door. The glow from the lamp faded a few feet down the path, but she had already been twice to the old hand pump and knew her way. When she was out in the night, she found that the darkness was no longer quite so impenetrable. The moon silvered the skyline of the hill, and the silhouettes of bushes and the pump itself stood out before her. She filled the kettle and turned back, walking slowly because of the weight and because of her growing appreciation of the rural tranquility, the sweet night silence and the stillness of the shadows. Then one of the shadows moved. Valerie stopped. There was a sudden pain in her throat as though fear had lodged there in a tight little knot and would not let her speak. She forced the sound out. Harry! A man stepped forward until the faint moonlight picked out his lean, almost predatory features. He dragged one leg slightly in a limp. The faint shuffle of his foot on the path was somehow more unnerving than the thin severity of his face. "Who are you?" Valerie demanded shakily. "I'm sorry if I have caused you any distress." The voice was precise and steely. "My name is Franklin, Dr. Franklin. Mine is the large house which, as you may have noticed, lies behind here." "No, we hadn't." "No matter. It's of no consequence." He was barring her way to the cottage door. She could not tell whether this was deliberate or not. "I am looking for someone, Mrs. Spaulding." The faint hesitation did not accord well with his sharp, jabbing manner. "Have you seen anyone?" Valerie was in no mood to be kept outside in the cold, answering vague questions about a vague person. "No," she said. "No one?" She took a step forward, expecting him to stand aside. Instead, he turned and limped into the cottage ahead of her. Furiously she followed and found him in the sitting room staring around, examining the place as though to lure someone out from behind the curtains or an armchair. Valerie dumped the kettle down. "Dr. Franklin, I've just told you that I've seen no one. Are you doubting my word?" He looked even more cadaverous in here than he had done in the hazy moonlight. His lips drooped in what might have been an unfathomable sadness, or a sneer. "Unfortunately," he said, "it has not been my experience that everyone invariably tells the truth. Even my own daughter." The cutting edge of his voice became even sharper. "My own daughter sometimes lies to me, Mrs. Spaulding." "Is it your daughter you are looking for, Doctor?" "I regret to say that it is. She is a great burden to me." His despondency seemed such an affectation, so intense and self-indulgent, that Valerie wanted to strike back at him. Impulsively she said, "Isn't it possible that it works the other way too? He stared and took his time in replying. It was not so much that he was slow in understanding as that he liked to keep his thoughts in order. She could tell that he wanted to consider each remark, classify it, assess the various possible responses, and do the subject full justice. That I am a burden to her? He mused. Then he shook his head decisively. No, it is not possible. Not possible at all. Valerie was not so sure. The man was pedantic in his outlook, not the type who would understand or make the effort to understand anything outside his own range of interests. If things did not fall into the right categories, he would dismiss them as worthless. Even now he was appraising her, as though about to deliver judgment on her speech, her dress, her appearance, and her reactions to his questioning. She said, "If I do see her, shall I tell her that you're looking for her?" He shrugged ungraciously. "She will know that, Mrs. Spaulding. And now, if you'll excuse me." Without further ceremony, he headed for the door. "Dr. Franklin." She stopped him, realizing suddenly that he knew more than it was possible for him to know. "You called me Mrs. Spaulding?" "Yes, of course. How did you know my name?" "My husband and I arrived here only a few hours ago. Although I am not active in the life of the village, I make a point of knowing what goes on. I am also capable of making reasonable deductions from observed facts. Did you know Charles Spaulding, my husband's brother?" Franklin hesitated again, then said brusquely, No, I did not have that pleasure. He died here, very recently." "I am aware of that. Do you happen to know what he died of, Dr. Franklin?" "I do not. I thought that perhaps he was your patient." "Patient?" Franklin looked puzzled. Unreasonably puzzled, thought Valerie. "That you were his doctor?" she said. He smiled. It was a thin smile, without warmth or humor. "No, Mrs. Spaulding. I was not his doctor." He resumed his progress towards the door. "Good night. We shall meet again, no doubt." When he had gone, Valerie stood at the door for a while, looking pensively out into the night, until its shapes became distinct and identifiable. Behind her, the cottage was warm and reassuring. She wondered where Dr. Franklin's house lay. Tomorrow she and Harry would explore. Once they had established the features of the district and seen them clearly in daylight, everything would be less bewildering and less frightening. Valerie did not want to admit that she was frightened. She tried to put out of her mind the senseless violence that had run wild through the cottage, and to think only of what it would be like in the years to come. There would be other people with whom she could make friends. Every tree and bush would become familiar. She would find out how to get into the nearest town for her shopping. She would go to church on Sundays. She would come to be accepted in Clagmore. There was no need to be frightened, no need to stare defiantly out into the night, daring it to bring forth its terrors. Nevertheless, she would be glad when Harry got home. She wished he would hurry. Citiere, the horse was ancient but trustworthy. It needed no guidance and no encouragement. Once started on its way, it plodded on with reassuring steadiness. It had all the deaf, dogged persistence of an old man who knew every turning, every slight rise and fall of the narrow road, and like an old man, it snuffled to itself, grunted, and grumbled damply as it went on its way. The harness creaked, and the cartwheels groaned, and, on a bend, squealed a protest. From the barren moor came the fitful cries of a night bird. Far away a dog barked. Harry, letting the reins rest in his hand because there was no point in indulging in splendid flourishes or snapping out commands, felt remote from his normal world. The brisk routine of army life meant nothing here. The scurrying feet of London struck no echoes from these country lanes. He could adjust contentedly to this new tempo of life, given the time. This was the true, enduring England. Suddenly the horse whinnied and stopped. Harry flicked the reins, letting them go slack and twitching them gently against the animal's flank. The horse swung its head from side to side, whinnied again, and then seemed to listen. A strange, ethereal music danced for a few seconds on the night air. It was no English pastoral melody, but a plaintive little sequence of notes which spoke of the East. Nothing could have been more out of place. An exotic oriental melody on a dour Cornish heathland. It was upsetting and dissonant. Harry sat quite still. The reedy sound of the pipe seemed to come closer, and then, like a mocking will-o'-the-wisp, to dodge away from him. He tried to follow the taunting tune, and found himself clambering down from the cart. The sound was hypnotic. It was music for a dance, but what strange alien kind of dance. The dog that had been barking in the distance began to howl. It bayed at the moon, and to his own amazement, Harry found that he too wanted to send up a cry of anguish to the skies. The dog's lament was an appeal for protection, an admission of fear, an awareness of strange powers that walked abroad in the darkness. The horse began to paw the ground. Its head jerked painfully from side to side. A rustle in the undergrowth made it edge sideways, so that the wheels of the cart scraped agonizingly on the rough surface of the lane. Harry calmed it and turned to face the gentle slope that fell away from the road. There were no hedges here. The moorland rolled off into infinity like a dark, descending sea. The whisper of the grass was the whisper of waves. One step out into that unknown ocean, and you could fall off the edge of the world. Angry with himself, and with the ridiculous impression that things were closing in on him, even on this barren expanse of land, Harry walked boldly off the road. Someone sprang at him, caught him by the shoulder, and twisted him round. Harry floundered and went down. There was a man's weight on his back, but he braced himself against the hard tufts of grass and kicked out. He was free. Before his assailant could leap again, Harry lashed out and gripped him by the throat. The two of them rolled a few yards and came to rest. Harry did not let go. He felt the man gurgling beneath his grip, and twisted the head round so that moonlight fell on the face. It was a distraught face, the eyes wide, the mouth working in panic. A handsome but weak face, like that of some unfortunate simpleton born into a noble family, a face filled with agony and reproach, as though subjected to one humiliating insult after another. Harry slackened his grip, and the man panted, "Let go of me this instant. How dare you?" Harry was taken aback. The intensity of the indignation was ludicrous in the circumstances. "What? How dare you set upon me like that? You could have killed me, you know." "I could have killed you?" "Or broken a bone, at least." The man writhed, becoming shrill and querulous. "My bones are very fragile, you know. They break very easily." Harry was convinced that he was dealing with a lunatic. It might have been wise to restrain the creature, but he was so surprised by the verbal attack that he let go and sat back. "Would you mind telling me who you are, and why you attacked me?" "I had to defend myself." The man stroked his throat, winced, and patted the side of his head as though to make sure there were no gashes in it. "And as to being attacked, I should be asking that of you." But then, his head bobbed forward, he grinned and snickered and twitched his nose at Harry. "I know who you are, don't I? You're Spaulding's brother. The one they killed. My name's Crockford. Peter Crockford. They call me Mad Peter, but only because I don't conform. And why should I conform if it doesn't suit me?" Harry got to his feet. The man who called himself Peter looked up warily, then got up and faced him. An echo of what he had said struck resonances in Harry's mind. He said, "What do you mean? They killed my brother. Didn't you know he was dead?" "I knew, and I'm not his brother." "I'm surprised you didn't know." "Of course I know," said Harry impatiently. It was hard to tell how much of the man's craziness was genuine, and how much an arch-calculated mockery. "But who are they?" "They," said Mad Peter simply. "Didn't you hear them just now? Listen. You'll hear them again." These were the ramblings of a lunatic. Yet his conviction was such that Harry stood motionless and listened. There was no sound. He couldn't imagine what they were supposed to be listening for. And he was in no mood for spending any more of the night here in the company of the village idiot. "Now look, Mr. Crockford. Look," echoed Mad Peter. "There's nothing to see, you know, only to hear." He put his head on one side, then moaned and touched his shoulder tenderly. "I do think you've broken something, I really do. You had no right to go skulking about in the dark like that." Again he tilted his head, and there was something oddly endearing in it, like the pleading antics of a dog. "You don't happen to have a drop of brandy on you? Medicinal, you know, or a cup of coffee?" Harry laughed. It was impossible not to like this strange creature. And there were things he had said which deserved following up. "Come on," he said, turning back towards the cart. "You'd better be our first guest." "Guest? My wife and I, for supper?" "Supper?" cried Mad Peter, as ecstatic now as he had been mournful a few seconds ago. "How perfectly delicious." The two of them climbed back onto the cart, and Harry flicked the reins. The horse at once started off without protest. In less than 5 minutes they reached the cottage. Light was muted by the patched-up curtains. The cottage looked self-contained, almost smug. It was a world of its own in a bleak moon-silvered landscape. Harry was eager to be back in that world. He was jabbed by a twinge of regret that he should have brought this peculiar stranger back for a meal which would have been so much more delightful if shared only by Valerie and himself, yet he had a presentiment that this eccentric had a great deal to tell him. Valerie heard his footsteps on the path. The door was thrown open to greet him. She opened her arms to him. It was only when she drew back, flushed and happy, from his embrace, that she realized Harry was not alone. He introduced Peter Crockford, who bowed formally and behaved with the greatest deference when shown into the sitting-room and offered a drink. The meal was ready. "I've been wondering if you would ever come back," said Valerie. Her laugh hid, but not very adequately, a tremor of apprehension. He laughed back, but knew that he must not leave her alone too often, until they were quite sure of their ground here. Without fuss she laid an extra place, so unobtrusively that even the most sensitive guest would not have been embarrassed or felt impelled to stammer out apologies for having arrived without warning. They sat down and ate. Harry found that he was hungry. A lot had happened since they had had their last meal. Time had flown past, filled with rather too many incidents for his liking. Mad Peter ate as heartily as his host. Valerie cast him a covert glance every now and then, as he sucked noisily at a chicken bone and burped over his glass of wine. But she knew that he appreciated every mouthful, and when she caught her husband's eye, she could not repress a smile. "Well, Mr. Crockford," said Harry at last, as the meal reached its final stages. "Much better, thank you," said Peter cheerfully. "We're waiting." "Waiting? Ah, waiting. But then, aren't we all?" "We're waiting," said Harry, "for your explanation." And with every right, Peter relinquished the last shred of chicken bone with undisguised regret. He looked hopefully at the coffee cups which Valerie had set to one side. After a minute or so, it became apparent that he had no intention of offering any explanation, or anything else, until it was forced out of him. "Well?" Harry persisted. "Would there be any coffee, Mrs. Spaulding?" asked Peter ingratiatingly. Valerie rose, but Harry stopped her with a gesture. "Not until he's told us something." Peter looked from one to the other, and tried to make a facetious grimace. It failed, and he was suddenly quite sane, sober and earnest. He said, "Yes, you've got a right to know. Excuse me a moment. I have to be sure that I know what I'm going to tell you." Valerie subsided into her chair. Peter took a deep breath and closed his eyes. Harry wanted to snap an order at him, but did not like to break into that unworldly trance. The man was making a big effort, the sort of effort a drunkard makes when he knows he must walk straight and talk coherently. The strain tightened a blue veinous thread across his forehead. At last he opened his eyes again, and began to speak in a laborious, painstaking way. "May I tell you something about myself? It may not be of any great importance in itself, but it may help to convince you that what I'm about to say is the truth, and not some colorful figment of my imagination." "May I?" "Please," breathed Valerie. "Thank you. I'm not mad, you know. They call me Mad Peter because I find it difficult to grasp some of the things which seem so important nowadays, like being able to make money and juggle with it and make more money. I can't even make the first little bit. But I'm not mad. A little vague, yes. Sensitive. Oh, my nerves are too close to the surface. I feel too much. Everything is too hot or too cold. I feel it and know it. I have a strong sense of good and evil, not just knowing what's good and what's evil, but sensing the presence of the fine thing and the bad thing. Knowing where it exists. He leaned forward suddenly across the table, jarring a plate to one side and not noticing it. This is an evil place, he said. Harry glanced quickly at Valerie and tried to smile. Valerie must pay no attention to this kind of nonsense. There must be no clouds in Valerie's sky. It was his job to make sure that there were none. Corrupt, said Peter, and evil. I can feel it taking the goodness out of me. It hasn't always been so. When I came here 10 years ago, or was it 15 or 20? When I came here it was a good place. People were kind and gentle. As God willed they should be. Tears shone unexpectedly in his eyes, and began to course gently, unchecked, down his cheeks. Then they came, bringing their vileness with them. Who came? Valerie demanded. Peter held up his hand. Please. If you interrupt me, I shall never remember what it was, I must say. He swayed, blinked, and went on slowly, gathering speed again as he talked. My parents had high hopes for me, God bless them. They hoped I might go into politics, but, he giggled, I was too stupid even for that. In the end they made me a small allowance, and let me go my way. Put me out to grass, as it were. I wandered the countryside and settled here in my own good time, because I found it a good place. He looked happily round the room, and then the happiness drained away as quickly as it had come. But I've just told you that. Now it's all going blurred again. I've forgotten. He lowered his head, as though expecting a blow, or a contemptuous dismissal. Valerie prompted him gently. And then they came. Peter shook with alarm. Who told you that? Who told you? You just told us, said Harry. Peter looked up, looked down again. A gleam of cunning lit his eyes, and then faded. He was withdrawing into his own shell again, listening to things nobody else could hear, and silently communing with his own fears and desires. Are you all right, Mr. Crockford? Asked Valerie. Listen. Peter sat bolt upright. They listened. Harry snorted. His patience was running out. I don't hear a thing. Listen, damn you. Peter's chair was kicked backwards. He was on his feet, reeling across the room. He dragged the curtains back. A few shreds came loose and fell to the floor. Peter pushed the window open. The clatter of the chair and the window had hammered into the head, and now were gone. There was silence. No, not silence. From the far distance could be heard the elusive, wayward sound of the pipe, which had called to Harry on his homeward journey. He was by his own fireside, yet now it sounded more eerie and menacing than it had done on the open, unprotected road. Damn! Peter was near to tears again. Damn! Damn! I feel it again. What is it? Valerie's head was poised, exquisite above her white throat and slim neck. Harry feasted his eyes on her, only half listening to the ramblings of the eccentric. Can't you hear, woman? Yes. I hear it now. The weird fluting skipped over a flurry of notes, and then sank to a slow, mournful dirge. What does it mean? It means death. How could it? I heard it. Mad Peter swung towards Harry. The night your brother died. What are you talking about, man? I heard it, I tell you, the night your brother died. Oh my God! Peter lunged for the door. Harry sprang from his seat and grabbed the man's arm. You don't leave until you've told us everything. Everything, do you hear me? Peter's face was so tortured that it was impossible to threaten him and impossible to hold him in that tight grip. Harry relaxed his hold, and Peter cried, I must go, and stumbled out of the room into the night. The sound of his feet stumbling down the path was cut off when he reached the gate. For a few seconds he seemed to stay on the road, and then perhaps to branch off across the grass. Harry looked at the dark rectangle of open doorway. He strode to the door and closed it. Valerie said, Harry, I'm frightened. He cursed the impulse that had led him to bring Mad Peter back to the house this evening. Yet perhaps he ought to have been cursing not that but his weakness in allowing the man to escape, without telling all that he had to tell. Behind the madness and the forgetfulness, there had been the glimmer of some disturbing truth. The question had still not been answered. How had Charles died? The day had been a tiring one, but Harry was unable to sleep. His weariness had gone beyond the desire for rest. He heard Valerie breathing quietly and steadily beside him. Valerie, who had restored order to the chaos of the cottage, cooked a splendid meal, and who now deserved hours of slumber. But questions kept jangling in his mind. None of them could be answered until morning. In daylight they could start afresh. But he could not persuade himself to relax and abandon the confusions of the past hectic day. Dozing but still resisting, he heard a long drawn-out moan. It seemed to come from below the window. Harry opened his eyes. Perhaps, after all, he had been drifting into sleep, and this had been part of a dream. The moan came again. Now it might have been the misery of a dog lamenting at the cottage door. Harry sat up. Thickly struggling up from the depths of sleep, Valerie murmured, "What is it, darling?" Harry swung his legs out of bed and thrust his feet into his slippers. "I don't know." Before she was fully awake, he was on his way down the cramped, twisted staircase. The sitting room was dark. The outline of the window was uneven, brightest at the corner where Mad Peter had torn the curtain away. Framed in the opening was a blackened face, distorted into the grimace of a gargoyle by the thick old-fashioned glass and the treacherous shadows. It mouthed hideously and then fell away. Harry stopped at the foot of the stairs. An attack on human enemies was one thing. A clash with hideous supernatural powers was quite another. He swore under his breath and stalked towards the door. It was time to put a stop once and for all to these fears and fancies. He opened the door and looked out. A crumpled shape sagged against the wall. The sound of its breathing was that of an animal in agony. Harry approached, ready for anything, but not ready for the black, distorted face, which was only just recognizable as that of Mad Peter. He put an arm under the man's shoulders and supported him, coaxing him away from the wall. Peter lurched against him and was clearly on the verge of collapse. Harry took his weight and shuffled back to the door. Valerie was on her way downstairs. She reached the bottom step and peered at them in the gloom. "Who is it?" "Our guest," said Harry curtly. "Or what's left of him." "The lamp, quickly." As the light spread along the wick and flared up, Valerie let out a scream. Then she put the lamp glass on and made herself look at Mad Peter's face. Harry lowered him into a chair, but Peter went limp. There was no strength left in his limbs. His face was swollen into a grotesque blackened mask, and dry foam flecked his lips. Harry tore open the collar that seemed to be throttling the man, but the only result was a quick, violent convulsion. Peter's eyes, lost in the twisted parody of a face, opened for one moment. A grating sound came from his throat. Then there was another convulsion, and he sagged forward. Harry said, "He's dead." "No." Valerie went down on her knees, trying to look into Peter's tortured face. "Look." Peter was struggling to say something. "Doctor, doctor?" "Yes." Harry stood back. "I'll fetch a doctor." Peter's hand groped out towards him. "Franklin," he croaked. "Doctor Franklin." "That's the man who lives close to us," said Valerie. "He dropped in while you were in the village, said we were neighbors." "Where?" Harry was reaching for his top coat from behind the door. "The big house at the back. That's all I got from him. There can't be all that many big houses." Harry went out. The house was easy to find. He struck up the slope at the back of the cottage and went through a small plantation of trees. The winds of the years had bent the trees so that they all stooped in one direction, tired of being beaten and thrashed about. When he emerged, he found himself facing a large square building, which could well have been the local manor. If it had once known great days, they had ended long ago. A tangle of creepers grabbed at Harry's ankles as he made his way through the grounds, and the driveway was overgrown with weeds. It was not surprising that at this hour of the night, or rather morning, there should be no lights shining from any of the windows. Yet the house, shrouded as it was in darkness, gave Harry the impression of being awake, secretly, mysteriously throbbing with the pulse of a strange life of its own. He was getting far too imaginative. He strode up to the front door and seized the ornate knocker. His touch jolted the door and it swung slowly inwards. Startled, he ventured in. One lamp burned dimly at the foot of a wide staircase. Otherwise the place was as still as the grave. But warmer, he thought immediately, than any grave. It was stifling in here. He wondered that anyone could bear to live in such an atmosphere. It was as though a great fire raged below the house in some hellish cellar. Dr. Franklin! He waited for the echoes to die away up the stairs, then called again. Dr. Franklin? There was no response. He waited, then crossed the hall and opened the first door on his left. The room was in darkness, the furniture ghostly in what little light seeped through. Harry went back to the foot of the staircase and shouted again. When there was still no reply, his inclination was to turn and storm out of the place. But he thought of Mad Peter's contorted features, and the memory drove him on up the stairs. A voice rang out behind him. Where the devil do you think you're going? Harry turned on the stair. A dark, saturnine man was staring up at him from the hall. The peremptory tone made it clear that this must be the owner of the house. Relief flooded through Harry as he descended quickly to the hall again. There's a man dying at my cottage. Could you come at once? What is it to me? Harry was staggered. The somber features of the man were impassive. It was impossible to believe that he could have grasped what Harry had just said. Look, Harry tried again. Perhaps I didn't make myself clear. You made yourself perfectly clear, Mr. Spaulding. There is a man dying at your cottage. And I repeat, what has that to do with me? You're a doctor, aren't you? Yes, I'm a doctor. But not of medicine. This was something which had not crossed Harry's mind. He let out a groan of despair. Dr. Franklin pursed his lips as though death was somehow a grim joke which, in his own embittered way, he rather enjoyed discussing. I am a doctor of theology, he said with a precise, almost prim enunciation. I fear I can be of little use to you in your trouble. Harry was at a loss. He could not go back to the cottage having achieved nothing. He needed help. He was a man of action, not a healer or a comforter. It was unthinkable that Franklin, if a doctor of theology, should be indifferent to the agonies of a fellow human being. He pleaded, "Could you just come and have a look? I'd appreciate your advice. We're new here, I know nothing of medicine, and I don't know who to ask for assistance in this neighborhood." Franklin stood like an implacable judge of human souls and human conduct, incorruptibly weighing one decision against another. He was clearly not to be hurried. And yet, Harry observed, in spite of the bleak manner he tried to preserve, he was breathing rather heavily. And where had he been at this time of night? What had he been doing before he came into the hall behind Harry and challenged him? Was he still winded from some mad dash across the countryside? The calm surface was only a veneer. Harry wiped his brow. The heat of the place, large as the hall was, began to tell on him. He was tired and dizzy. Very well, said Franklin at last. But you must clearly understand that my knowledge is limited also. They went back through the trees and down the slope to the cottage. Harry noticed that Franklin had a pronounced limp, but it did not seem to impede him at all. He strode out at a pace that even Harry found it hard to match, not knowing the lie of the land as well as the doctor did. In the sitting room of the cottage, Franklin looked round arrogantly and nodded at Valerie, in the merest sketch of formal politeness. On the floor, the white tablecloth was humped up into an unnatural shape. Harry looked down at it, and at Mad Peter's feet, pitifully sticking out from one end. We're too late. Valerie nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Harry bent over the body and pulled the cloth back. Peter's head was twisted to one side, the features frozen into a mask of agony. The foam was dry on his lips and his eyes stared unseeingly from mottled pouches of puffed-up flesh. Franklin's impassivity was shaken. He suppressed a gasp. A spasm of revulsion shook him, and then he turned away and fought for control of himself. Have you any idea what it could have been? Asked Harry. He was an epileptic. The answer was snapped out authoritatively, in spite of Franklin's earlier protestations that he was not a medical expert. He must have had a seizure. But the blackening of his face, the swelling. I only know, said Franklin violently, that this man was subject to fits, I suggest that this was the result of one of them. Please don't force me to express professional opinions I am not qualified to hold. He took a deep, shuddering breath. When he turned to Valerie, his manner was once again pedantic and rather fussy. Although the matter is, strictly speaking, no concern of mine, I shall be prepared to see to, all the distressing arrangements. Harry decided it was time to take the initiative. It's kind of you, but I'm sure that if you tell us who we should get in touch with first thing in the morning. I know the people here, said Franklin. I know the procedure. Please leave it in my hands. Valerie looked at the wretched huddle of death on the floor, and then at Harry. He could see that she longed only to be free from this pitiful but terrible intruder. If Franklin knew what to do, she would be only too glad to let him take charge. He nodded faintly. Valerie turned to Franklin and whispered, "Thank you." The doctor went to the door. "I shall not wish you good night, as you are scarcely likely to have one after your experience. However, I will express my regret that your arrival here should have been so unpleasant. Mrs. Spaulding, sir." With a little bow, he had gone. Harry and Valerie moved towards each other, and then realized that the mound of the corpse lay between them. Harry edged round it. He had seen death before, and although his experiences had not hardened him, he prided himself that he could face up to the reality of it when necessary. But never before had he seen anything so disturbing, somehow so obscene, as this stricken creature at his feet. "Darling!" Before Valerie could rush into his arms, they heard a faint rustle from the doorway. The door had opened silently, and the only sound was that of the breeze sighing into the room. But framed in the opening was a dark-skinned man, with the deep yet expressionless eyes of a Malay. For him to have come out of the rural English night was the most incongruous thing in a day and night of insane fantasies. Valerie gripped Harry's arm. The Malay bowed to each of them in turn, and then advanced into the room. He stood above the corpse, and lowered his gaze slowly, in what might have been reverence, or no more than a languid curiosity. Abruptly he stooped and slid his arms under the corpse. Harry stepped forward to assist. The Malay shook his head once. With a neat twist, he flung the body across his shoulder, and padded soundlessly out into the night. Pet. There were only 3 mourners at Mad Peter's funeral. Valerie and Harry stood on one side of the grave, Tom Bailey on the other. They watched the earth drop on to the simple wooden coffin. Valerie stooped and sprinkled a few crumbling fragments over it, and then stood back as the vicar, hardly appearing to notice their presence, turned and doddered back towards his church. Tom Bailey came round the dark new hole in the ground. Valerie had been introduced to him briefly by Harry when they arrived for the ceremony, and had at once liked his square, reliable face and the firmness of his handshake. As soon as Tom joined them now, she said, "Surely he must have had some friends. I mean, other than yourself, Mr. Bailey." "He had, Mum. A lot of friends, spite of his funny ways." "Then, where are they all?" "Heavily shy and uncertain." He scraped his feet along the path like a horse pawing the ground. "Because of what he died of," he muttered. "But what did he die of? There's no doctor here to tell us." "No, there's no doctor. But the coroner comes round to fill in his report every month. And he knows better than to ask any awkward questions. Heart failure's what he'll say." Tom drew level with them again, glancing apprehensively over his shoulder. He nodded towards the village, locked in its secretive trance. "But they'll say he died of the Black Death." "The what?" said Harry incredulously. "The Black Death." "But what's that?" asked Valerie. "What he died of, Ma'am," said Tom artlessly. They crossed the road in front of the inn. It was late morning, and one would have expected some sign of activity around the houses, but nobody stirred. They must be all out in the fields, Valerie assured herself. It was logical enough, yet she didn't quite believe it. Tom looked sheepish as they stopped at his door. He was evidently torn between remaining loyal to the people among whom he had come to live, though they would always regard him as a foreigner, and showing himself a civilized chap to these newcomers. "Can I invite you both in for a little refreshment?" "I won't, thank you, Mr. Bailey." Valerie was anxious to get back and do some more work on the cottage, as well as preparing a meal. "It'll be in my parlour," said Tom anxiously. "All perfectly respectable." She laughed. "Even so, I think I'd better get back. She touched Harry's arm. But you stay, darling. I can do without you under my feet for half an hour or so. Like to borrow Tom's cart? I'm sure he'd. Please, Mum. You just wait here while I bring it round. Tom was eager to agree. But she wanted to walk. She proposed to see all there was to be seen between here and the cottage, to soak up the atmosphere, and in return, to impose her own authority on it. A walk would do her good. A contact with reality after the strangeness of these disturbing events. The day was mild, and the countryside looked somehow less harsh than when they had come down to the village for the funeral. She reached the summit of the hill, and looked out across the moors. Life here could be beautiful. She would learn to appreciate all that was best in the changing seasons. A few feet from the verge of the road, a clump of wild flowers burned with a pale glow in the middle of the bracken. She picked her way towards them, and stooped to collect a few for the cottage. To her right was another gleam, shining more harshly. Half hidden in the bracken was a wicked-looking trap with open jaws. The hideous threat of those waiting teeth was too much for her. Valerie found a thick twig and sprung the trap, wincing as the jaws clanged shut. She finished assembling her bouquet, and went on towards the cottage. The door was half open. Harry had not troubled to lock it, pointing out that the windows were so rickety and easy to open, that it was absurd to take precautions with the door. People who wanted to break in could do so without difficulty. That had already been proved. Valerie went in, then she stopped, dumbfounded. The room was rich with flowers. Flamboyant exotic blooms which put her own little posy to shame were flaunting their cerise orange and yellow heads from jars and vases, and even from the dented shape of the battered kettle. Valerie moved warily into the room. Too many things had happened in too short a time. She could not imagine what this new development might portend. There was a step on the stairs. A girl came down, carefully supporting herself against the plaster wall with one hand, while she carried a few flowers in the other. At the bottom she came face to face with Valerie, and stopped dead. "Oh dear. I had so hoped to be finished before you came back. It was meant to be a sort of welcome." She was dark and slim, with an olive-tinged complexion, which Valerie envied even at first glance. Although she was neatly dressed in a white shirt and a long grey skirt, in some inexplicable way she looked as exotic as the flowers she had distributed round the room so lavishly. "The door was open," she said timidly. "But how kind of you. I heard all about your terrible experience when you got here. I thought perhaps these might help to take away an unhappy memory." There was assuredly a world of difference between that first welcome, if one could call it such, and this one. "They will, of course," said Valerie gratefully. "But who are you?" "I'm so sorry. Your neighbor. I am Anna Franklin." "Then I've met your father." A flicker of fear twitched in the girl's beautiful face. "Yes, I know. He was searching for you. I hope he wasn't too furious when he found you." The girl's grip on her few remaining flowers slackened, so that they curled over and dropped from her hand. "No," she said in a small voice. "That's good. Won't you stay for a cup of coffee?" "I'm Valerie Spaulding, as I expect you know." Everyone, thought Valerie ruefully, seemed to know, while she and Harry knew nothing of the community in which they had come to live. Anna nodded. Her eagerness was very appealing. She must be in her 20s. But there was something young and shy about her. Something that yearned for friendship but feared a rebuff. It must be a lonely life for a girl of her age. Dr. Franklin had not given Valerie the impression of being a man with many friends, or a man who would encourage his daughter to make her own. Valerie realized she was still holding her little bunch of wild flowers. "I think these had better go in some quiet corner," she said, "if there's any room left." She went towards the kitchen. Anna came demurely after her, as though anxious not to let this new friend out of her sight. "Your flowers," Valerie looked back from the kitchen door at the rainbow of blooms, "are really magnificent. I don't think I've ever seen such a gorgeous display." "Father grows them," said Anna. Then, in a rush, she said, "I really came to ask if you and your husband would come to dinner with us." Valerie was surprised. She had not expected an invitation of this kind. She wanted to ask more, to make sure it was all right, but Anna was waiting on tenterhooks, hardly daring to breathe until she got her answer. Valerie said, "We'd like to. Tonight? Well, Please," said Anna urgently. "Tonight? Yes. And thank you." "Oh no. It's I who have to thank you." Before Valerie could question her, Anna raced on. "Can I do anything?" Valerie nodded towards the large black kettle. It was pretty well the only receptacle in the place which had not been used for the floral display. "If you wouldn't mind, the pump's in the yard outside." Anna gladly took the kettle and went across the sitting room to the door. Valerie followed her at a more leisurely pace with cups and saucers on a tray, which she set down on the table. Suddenly she heard Anna's feet hurrying back up the path. The kettle swinging from her hand had obviously not been filled. She was pale as she came into the room, and the impulsive happiness had quite faded from her eyes. They looked dark, fathomless, as clouded as a poisoned pool. Behind her, beyond the overgrown garden, Valerie glimpsed a movement. For a split second she thought she saw the Malay, but then there was only the tangle of briars leaning perilously over the doorway. "What's wrong, Anna?" "I must go, but I must." Of course, there was no point in trying to deal with the girl's distress when there was no clue to its cause. "But are you sure you're all right? You look so pale." "I must go," repeated Anna hypnotically. "You'll come again?" Yes. Anna swept into the kitchen and put the kettle down with a bang. She came out again, hurrying towards the door. When she reached it, she stopped in her tracks, staring. Dr. Franklin stepped from the path into the cottage. "What are you doing here, Anna?" "I'm sorry, Father. You did not have my permission to come here." His insulting indifference to her presence enraged Valerie. She said, "Surely Anna doesn't need your permission just to pay an ordinary social call, Dr. Franklin?" The bony structure of his forehead seemed to force its way upwards through the skin, tense with anger, strained to a bleached whiteness. "Do not interfere with matters which you don't understand, Mrs. Spaulding." "Matters," he added viciously, "which don't concern you. Father, please." "Anna." The girl bowed her head in submission. Franklin stood to one side, and she walked humbly past him. On the path outside, she stopped and ventured a glance back at Valerie. Franklin said, "I realize the sort of image I have created of myself, Mrs. Spaulding, but believe me, things are not as simple and straightforward as they may seem." "I'm sorry," said Valerie stiffly. "Of course it is none of my business. It's not my place to criticize." But he could be in no doubt that the criticism was there. Abruptly, to her amazement, he smiled and put out a hand towards her, then let it fall to his side. It was an appeal as pathetic in its way as Anna's, and as baffling. "I'm not really an ogre, Mrs. Spaulding." Valerie plunged. If sense was ever to be made of this situation, she must go through with it to the end. She said as lightly as possible, "I'm glad to know it, as we are to have the pleasure of dining with you tonight." Franklin's face clouded again. He glanced at Anna. "Please, Father." "Very well." The words were dragged out of him. He turned back to Valerie. "Until tonight, then." The rebuff of his coldness was almost enough to make her withdraw the acceptance. Obviously it would mean nothing but trouble for Anna when she got home. But the two of them were already on their way towards the lane. Valerie watched them until they were out of sight. She wondered how a father and daughter could distress each other so, and wondered if she and Harry would find out this evening, and if they would be sorry. Perhaps unhappy people were best left to their unhappiness. For herself, she wanted only Harry and the joy he brought her. But Anna Franklin had appealed to her, in looks as much as in words. It was too late to turn back. Cest. Tom Bailey poured 2 large brandies and passed one to Harry. They drank after a silent, companionable nod to each other. Harry looked round the snug little parlour. It was more like the cabin of a ship than a private room behind an inn bar. There were 3 ships in bottles, a rough plaster cast of a mermaid, a heavy book with a stained cover which might have been a family Bible, but suggested a ship's log, and an assortment of shells and large iridescent pebbles along the window ledge. Over the fireplace was a yellowing daguerreotype of a ship with 2 billowing sails and 2 belching funnels. If the floor had tilted slightly, Harry would not have been surprised. Perhaps if the skipper, or rather the landlord, gave him enough brandy it would oblige. He took another sip and then said bluntly, "How many have died from this Black Death? Before my brother, I mean. Because I'm assuming that he was one of the victims, just like Mad Peter?" Tom frowned over his glass as though accusing Harry of a breach of hospitality. Then he said awkwardly, "A few." "And what do you think killed him?" "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean, Tom. Look, I'm a professional soldier. I've knocked about the world quite a bit, and seen some pretty strange things. Some of them I couldn't fathom out at all, but just because I couldn't understand them, didn't have the time to investigate, damn it, that doesn't mean they didn't have some perfectly logical explanation. And there must be a perfectly logical explanation to all this too. You know there must be." Tom took his time. He looked round at his little treasures, seeking their support. "I was a professional sailor, Mr. Spaulding. You can see that. And I'm like you, I knocked around the world. Right round, in fact, several times. And I've seen things so strange that no amount of your logic could ever explain them away." "Magic?" said Harry skeptically. "All that mumbo-jumbo? We've all seen that. Or what's supposed to be magic, and witchcraft." "Well then," mumbled Tom, "you're not suggesting people in this village were killed that way?" "I don't know, and I don't intend to try finding out." Tom's gravity made it impossible to sneer at him. Harry changed his tack and said, "How well did you know my brother, Tom?" "Well, oh, I knew him all right." "Did you like him?" "Yes," said Tom in an undertone as though afraid to speak out too boldly. "Yes, I liked him. He kept himself pretty much to himself up there, but, well, what I did see of him I liked very much. And Mad Peter? You were the only one who went to his funeral, apart from us. The only one who went to the trouble, or took the risk." "What are you getting at? You liked them, but you don't care how they died?" Tom slammed his glass down. It was a wonder it didn't break. He said tensely, "Yes, I do care, Mr. Spaulding. I care very much. Then, I also care about myself. All the time I was at sea, I dreamed of owning a little place like this. I was going to settle down, and it was going to be somewhere peaceful. No storms, no trouble. Now I've got it, I want to keep it. I want to live my days out here, and to die here, in bed. Not to be found out there with my face all black, foaming at the mouth." "You mean you're frightened?" "Yes," said Tom. "I'm frightened. For the first time in my life, I'm really frightened. I'm sorry." Harry finished his drink, and put the glass down more carefully than Tom had done. "I shouldn't have said that." Tom shook his head dolefully. "I don't blame you, Mr. Spaulding. Look, I'd like to help you, but—" He struggled with something inside himself, then shook his head again, forcefully this time. "No. Nothing I can do." Harry was in a troubled mood as he set out on his homeward journey. It was ironical to think that such a short time ago they had been promising themselves an idyllic honeymoon in the sleepy calm of the countryside. And after that, there had been the promise of blending gradually with the community, learning to know the people and their ways. Harry still wanted to know more about the people and their ways, but not in any spirit of easy camaraderie. He would like to get his hands on a few of them and shake the truth out of them. He quickened his pace as he approached the cottage. Valerie had gone home quite some time ago, and for the first time he was shaken by a fear that she might have walked into yet further complexities. He ought not to have let her go alone. But she was in the cottage, and safe. They clung to each other for a long minute. Then they both began to speak at once, laughed, and were both silent. "Go on," said Valerie. "Tell me what Tom had to talk about." "No, if you—" "Go on," she said, kissing him. "You first." He told her how little he had gleaned from Tom. She nodded. It was no more and no less than she had expected. "Everything's so cloudy," she said. "Nothing makes any sense. The world out there," she waved towards the window, "looks solid enough, but it's all wrong somewhere. Somewhere, somehow." Harry sat down, and she told him that she had had a visitor. "Bringing me flowers," she said meaningly, and he realized that the room was full of luxuriant colors and that he had not even noticed them. "Just like a man," she said. "An invitation to dinner." He had looked forward to a quiet evening with his wife. His wife, an incredible but delightful concept. He was still not used to the idea or to Valerie, but there were mysteries to be solved. He would not be happy until these irritating veils of secrecy were torn aside. At least Dr. Franklin was an educated man, if not by any means a likable one, and it ought to be possible to challenge him as man to man. Round the dinner table, they might establish a sounder relationship. "I said we'd come," said Valerie tentatively. "I hope you don't mind." "We'll be delighted to have dinner there," Harry assured her. His hopes fell slightly as they approached the house. It was just as forbidding as when he had come upon it for the first time in the small hours of that unforgettable morning. One thing, however, he had forgotten: the heat that welled out as soon as the front door was opened. Valerie, in a long evening frock with bare shoulders, might welcome such a temperature, but it didn't suit Harry. When they sat down to eat, there were only 3 of them. Dr. Franklin was civil but certainly not an effusive host. He offered no explanation for the absence of his daughter. The food was served by the Malay who had come to collect Mad Peter's corpse. Harry saw Valerie shiver. Whatever thoughts might be passing through her mind, they must be grim. There was no draught of cool air in here to explain the tremor. An unlabeled bottle of wine was placed at Franklin's elbow. He drew a glass towards him. "I trust you will enjoy this wine, Mrs. Spaulding. It is made not from grapes but from rice. I serve it slightly warmed." He observed her glance at Harry, and smiled his thin, melancholy smile. "Don't be alarmed. It is really quite palatable." He passed the glass to Valerie and filled another one for Harry. They drank. Harry would have preferred a cool draught of hock, but he had to admit that in its way, the oddly insipid taste of the wine, and the lukewarm glow of it on his palate, were right for this oppressive atmosphere. "Have no fear, Mr. Spaulding, it is not poisoned." The remark failed to be even mildly funny. Harry thought of Mad Peter's agonized face, and the torment of his death throes. And inevitably, he thought of his brother and visualized the same convulsions. He set the glass down, and plucked instinctively at his collar. "Do you find it too hot in here?" asked Franklin. "I am used to it. In fact, I need it. Anna and I have spent most of our lives in hot climates." Valerie seized this opportunity with a brashness of which Harry would not have been capable. "Is Anna not joining us, Dr. Franklin?" Their host's face hardened. "No. I hope she's not indisposed?" "She is being punished." There was an embarrassed silence. "I'm sorry to hear that," said Harry, knowing that he was not carrying it off with Valerie's flourish. "I had hoped to make her acquaintance." "So you shall, Mr. Spaulding. Later." This firmly ended the subject. Harry saw that he was not going to make much headway with Franklin unless the doctor chose of his own accord to confide in him, and he did not give the impression of being a confiding sort of man. The Malay moved softly in and out, setting a fine array of small, spiced dishes before them. Some were subtly flavored, and some burnt with a fire more potent than the wine, yet without spoiling the gentler tastes. Dr. Franklin asked Harry about his career, and nodded courteously at each experience as it was recounted. On the surface, everything was pleasant, leisurely, and uncomplicated. But Harry found it a strain. Basically, he was sure that Franklin took no real interest in the conversation. Because his daughter had issued the invitation, he had felt bound to honor it. But this was not a house where visitors were welcome, and not a dinner table at which social chatter flowed freely. At the end of the meal, Harry observed a swift glance pass between Franklin and the Malay. The Malay raised an eyebrow. It seemed to be enough. Franklin nodded almost imperceptibly. There was something in the interchange which suggested that their relationship was not merely that of master and servant. "I suggest we have coffee in the library," said Franklin. As they crossed the hall, there was a faint rustling from the head of the stairs. Harry looked up. A dark girl in a gleaming sari stood on the landing. The colors of the silk ran in and out with the restlessness of living things. When she took one step down, they glowed and shimmered and fell into new patterns, never still, never to be captured. "Anna," said Franklin levelly, "your guests are here." "Thank you, Father." She hurried lightly down the stairs. The musky scent of her perfume swirled around her, as alien and compelling as the flowers she had brought to the cottage. She glanced shyly but with a certain feminine challenge at Harry, then put out her hands in welcome to Valerie. "May I introduce my husband?" said Valerie. "Harry, this is Anna Franklin." The girl's hand seemed to glide through his. His own palm was clammy with the heat, but hers was smooth and sinuous. Dr. Franklin said peremptorily, "Anna, perhaps you'd like to show Mrs. Spaulding your pets?" The welcoming smile on her face dissolved into abject fear. "Your pets, Anna," said her father. Perhaps Mrs. Spaulding isn't interested." Franklin looked at Valerie. "Are you interested in animals? Most Englishwomen are." "Why, yes. I love them. But if it's inconvenient, Anna will be delighted to show you her little collection." Of course, Anna had recovered. She stood to one side and waited for Valerie to approach the stairs. Harry was tempted to put out a hand and hold his wife back. But this was Franklin's house, and Franklin's daughter. He would have to play along with the man as civilly as possible until he became utterly intolerable. "A cigar," said Franklin as the two girls went upstairs. He took a cigar case from his pocket and held it out. The case was covered with a dark, exquisite skin of some kind. "Mr. Spaulding," Franklin was already leading the way across the hall to the library as he spoke. "May I speak with you frankly?" The Malay appeared, silent as ever, and opened the library door. When they were settled in armchairs, he brought in a silver tray with the coffee, and then went out again. As Franklin poured coffee, Harry looked round the room. It was less a library than a museum. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but only a certain number of the shelves actually held books. Instead there were impressive arrays of small, delicately carved ivories, divided into groups by an occasional elaborately patterned vase. A green jade dragon sprawled along one shelf, with its head snarling out into the room. A porcelain lion with a face like a pug curled up on a tall stand in the middle of the room. Harry said, "You've travelled a lot, Doctor." "Yes." Franklin spared the room but a brief glance and said, "I asked if I might speak frankly. I proposed to do so." "You too have travelled, Mr. Spaulding. Or is it Captain Spaulding, Major Spaulding?" Captain Spaulding. "May I suggest that you continue your travels as soon as possible? I'm afraid I don't understand. Clagmore is not the place for people like you and your charming wife, particularly if she is to be left here alone when you, presumably, rejoin your regiment, or brigade in due course. This is a very primitive community, sunk in its old ways. Cornwall is jealous of its secrets, you know, and doesn't take kindly to strangers. But you yourself chose to settle here," Harry pointed out. "Many is the time I have regretted it." There was no denying the sincerity of the outburst. Franklin went on more calmly. "This is an unhealthy place. I would not recommend young people to stay here. You will make no friends, and if something happens to either you or Mrs. Spaulding—" "Something?" Harry echoed. "What would happen, Doctor? What does happen to people here? What is there to be so secretive about?" "I was only saying that if something happened, you would be far from friends, far from anyone who could help you. My advice to you is that you should leave without delay. You're holding back a lot that I would like to be told. I think the time has come, Doctor, when you should be honest with me." "I am honest," said Franklin fervently, "in saying that it is in your own interest to get away from here." The events of the last few days had already tended to make Harry consider this course of action, but he stiffened in an instinctive resistance to any attempt to intimidate him. He said, "I have no intention of leaving. I wish I could persuade you to see that nothing you have said so far will persuade me." "I see." Franklin sipped his coffee, as though to take away the taste of an unpalatable memory. "But if anything unpleasant should occur, such as—" Harry insisted, "If anything unpleasant should occur, please remember that you were warned." The door opened with more noise than the Malay would have made. Anna and Valerie swept in. They made a striking picture, a striking contrast. Valerie was tall and fair and very English. Anna must presumably be English, but her Oriental garb and the Oriental tinge of the room made a more appropriate setting for her than would a country lane or the cottage down the slope. Harry and Franklin rose to their feet. Harry waited for Valerie to say something about the animals she had just seen, whatever they might be, but Franklin spoke first. "Anna dear, why don't you play something for our guests?" He smiled from Harry to Valerie, suddenly and incongruously, an indulgent father wanting to show off his daughter's skills. "Anna is an accomplished musician, really quite brilliant. Do you like music, Mrs. Spaulding? Captain Spaulding?" "I like a good tune," said Harry. "A good tune? Yes, well, we'll have to see what we can do. Anna." It was both an encouragement and an order. Anna went to a curtained recess in one corner of the room, and drew from it a lavishly inlaid stringed instrument, which Harry thought vaguely must be some kind of guitar. Anna seated herself on the floor in the center of an Indian rug, and laid the instrument across her knees. She looked at her father, waiting for his permission to start. Franklin nodded. Anna stroked the strings. They thrummed gently into life. She began to pluck at them in a strange stumbling rhythm, which seemed first to limp and then to spring. The melody which emerged was disturbing. To Western ears it had no obvious pattern, no familiar rise and fall. Franklin leaned towards Harry. "The instrument," he murmured, "is a sitar. Anna spends many hours with it. An accomplished performer, don't you think?" Harry, a bit out of his depth, nodded. Franklin half closed his eyes. The sternness of his features relaxed. He appeared to sink into a reverie, remembering things that would be meaningless to anyone else, surrendering to the music with an enviable completeness. Anna's fingers flew madly in a complex dance over the strings, to and fro. She might have been weaving, creating a design in sound rather than in cloth. Her eyes were fixed on some spot in the middle distance. Like her father, she was in a kind of trance. Her fingers played on their own, taking possession of her mind rather than being controlled by it. Suddenly, Harry heard a recognizable theme through the exotic counterpoint. Distinctly, plucked from the swirling rhythms with the force of a church chorale, he made out the plaintive tune he had heard somewhere else, so recently, somewhere close at hand. Then he remembered. It was the eerie melody which had fluted from the darkness when he met Mad Peter. The melody which they had heard later, and which Peter declared was a prediction of death. Franklin was jerked from his reverie. He sat bolt upright, his features contorted with anger. Beyond him, the door opened. The Malay stood in the opening, looking in with an odd, appreciative smile. Then he was gone. Franklin pushed himself up to his feet. "Stop!" The shout cut across the throbbing of the strings. The music collapsed into a jangling discord. Anna, bewildered, looked up at her father. For a few minutes she had forgotten him, forgotten everything. Franklin snatched the instrument from her and hurled it across the room. It snapped and splintered against the edge of a bookcase. Anna scrambled up. Her arm was raised to ward off a blow. It would certainly have come, Harry sensed it, if he and Valerie had not been there. As it was, Franklin made a terrific effort. He shook as though with an ague, and his arm was trembling with the desire to strike out at his daughter. Virulently he said, "Get out of my sight!" Anna backed away, then turned and ran. She dragged the door open, and they heard the swish of her sari as she raced across the hall, a sound like a dying, shuddering breath. Harry said, "Dr. Franklin, it's not my place to interfere." "Then don't." It would have given Harry the greatest satisfaction to strike the man down where he stood. But there was a certain code to which he adhered, a discipline which had been drummed into him. "We're leaving, Valerie." She hesitated, staring at him reproachfully. A woman, of course, would expect to see some violence done in the circumstances. Harry smiled wryly. Valerie turned, then went towards the hall. Franklin clapped his hands once. By the time Valerie was in the middle of the hall, the Malay was advancing with her coat. The gleam in his eyes was mocking rather than deferential. Harry took the coat from him and put it across Valerie's shoulders. "Good night, Dr. Franklin." Franklin paid no attention. He had turned away from the library door, and was beginning to mount the stairs slowly and purposefully. Harry took Valerie's arm, and guided her over the rougher patches of ground, and through the trees to the smoother slope above the cottage. She did not speak until they were clear of the trees. Then she said tautly, "How could you let him? I've no jurisdiction over Dr. Franklin in his own house, or anywhere else for that matter. You should have stopped him." "In his own house?" said Harry again, seething because he had wanted to manhandle Franklin, and had had to restrain himself. He was obviously going straight upstairs to beat her. "We can't be sure." "I can be sure," said Valerie. She stumbled on the path above the cottage, but shook off Harry's arm when he tried to support her. "I think you're afraid of him." "Yes." Harry spat out the word in a fury and said no more until he had opened the door and let Valerie walk in past him. She crossed the room and lit the lamp. When she turned and looked into his face, she wavered and then ran to him. She put her arms round him. "Darling, I'm sorry. I'm so awfully sorry. It was a stupid thing to say. It's just that I was so upset." "Don't think I wasn't," said Harry. "That house, that man, that loathsome little servant. I wish I knew what was going on." "And the animals," said Valerie thoughtfully. "The animals?" "Oh, yes. What was so special about those animals?" Valerie shook her head. They weren't what I expected. They were all so small. Mice, and even rats, and little furry creatures of all kinds. A couple of puppies, but even the puppies weren't romping around. They were all in cages. Locked up for the night? It looked as though they spent most of their time there. A sort of zoo or what? "I don't know." Valerie's brow was puckered with worry. There was something doomed about them, something frightening. They weren't just pets. Anna didn't want to touch them, I could see that. And yet at the same time she was drawn towards them. At one moment I distinctly saw her gloating over them. That's the only way I can describe it, gloating. And then she started sobbing, and said her father would try to make us leave, and we mustn't leave, we must stay near her. "He certainly tried that," Harry agreed. They sat at the table in the glow of the lamp, while he told her of Franklin's attempts to persuade him that Clagmore was unhealthy, and that they were not welcome here. "And I believe him on that score," he finished grimly. "But I've no intention of being driven out by that fellow or anyone like him." Valerie put out her hand to him across the table. He gripped it, and they smiled at each other, then looked proudly round the little room. This was theirs. They were not going to abandon it. His wandering gaze lit on the cat's basket. It was empty. Katie must be exploring the kitchen or the bedroom. Or perhaps she was out sniffing the enticing smells of the night and would be back in the morning. But Katie did not come back. Katie had vanished. 7. In the middle of the morning, there was a knock at the front door of the cottage. Harry had only just got in after an unavailing tramp over the surrounding fields in search of the cat. He hurried to the door, wondering if some farmer or one of the villagers could at last be showing some sign of neighborliness and returning Katie. When he opened the door, he was confronted by Tom Bailey, with a heavily laden basket on his arm. Tom scuffed his feet, cleared his throat and grunted. "I've brought you a few things." Valerie appeared from the kitchen. "Mr. Bailey, how thoughtful of you." "Thought you might not know the best way of going about getting stuff," said Tom with gruff awkwardness. "So to tide you over like—" He lowered the basket to the floor. Valerie picked it up, winced laughingly at the weight, and said, "Do come in and sit down for a few minutes, Mr. Bailey." "Well, I won't say no. But please, call me Tom." Harry tried to take the basket from Valerie, but she shook her head and went out to the kitchen to unload the food which was piled high in it. Tom watched her go, then said with a diffidence that was touching in so tough and weather-beaten a man, I didn't only come up to deliver that lot. I came to do something I don't often have to do. And I don't like it when I have to. I came to admit I was wrong, Mr. Spaulding. I'm sorry." "Wrong? Can't keep yourself to yourself when there's things like this going on. It ain't right." "You mean," light dawned on Harry, You'll help me? Tom nodded. I'll help you. And reckon I know a good place to begin. When do we begin then? Not both of us, said Tom. Not right away. I do the first bit, and then I want you to come down to my place tonight. Late. Can you do that? He jerked his head towards the kitchen door. Will she be frightened to stay here on her own? Not if I know her, said Harry proudly. But he lowered his voice automatically. What time tonight? How late? After midnight. Tom would say no more, and would not stay long when Valerie was back in the room. When he had gone, Harry explained what had happened. There was really not much to tell. It all sounded very flimsy, he realized. But it was the first offer of help he had received, and it came from a man for whom he felt an instinctive liking. Tom Bailey had lived here long enough to learn a great deal about the local people and their ways, but not so long that he had become as churlish and withdrawn as they were. As he might have anticipated, Valerie said that she wanted to come with him that night. Not because she was frightened, simply because she wanted to know what secrets Tom had to tell. Harry refused to contemplate it. She argued. He finally defeated her. She bowed to his authority, reluctantly, but with a sweetness that warmed his heart. When I leave, he said that evening, you're to lock the door behind me and keep it locked. And make sure the catch on the window is secure. And I'll keep the poker on my lap until you come home, she laughed. But although she tried to remain cheerful and to imply that really it was an absurd situation, probably exaggerated out of all proportion, when the time came for him to leave the cottage, she held on to him for a long moment. There was a throb in her voice as she said, "Don't walk into a trap, will you? Don't let yourself be tricked, and if there's real danger, please run away. Please, for my sake." Rain had started as Harry walked away from the cottage. By the time he approached the village, it was falling steadily. The edges of the lane were muddy, and the cobbles of the village street were streaming with water. The unrelenting hiss of the rain, though, had the effect of muffling his footsteps. He reached the side door of the inn, and rapped sharply but quietly on the woodwork. Tom must have been waiting only a few feet away. The door was opened at once, and Harry slipped inside. Tom led him into the center of the bar, and on towards the parlor at the back. "You're not squeamish, are you?" "I've had practice in not being," Harry bristled. When the door of the parlor was closed, Tom turned up the wick of an oil lamp which was burning low. He stood aside and waved Harry forward. Lying stretched out on the table was Mad Peter. "It's all right," said Tom dourly. "He's still dead." He edged past Harry and raised one of Peter's eyelids. The dead eye stared hopelessly upwards. Harry tried not to gag at the sight of that tragic face and the useless eye that would never see sun or moon, green fields or winding lanes again. He spluttered. "How in the devil's name?" "I dug him up. Just now. That's his box." Tom indicated a coffin propped up in the corner. "And I called you a coward. I've seen too many dead uns to be frightened of him." "But why?" "I reckon there's some things that ought to be looked at. Take some looking for, mind. But when I'd got him here in a good light, I found what I was after. Here, give me a hand with him." The two of them lifted the body so that it was half sitting. The head lolled forward. Tom pointed to the neck and tried to turn it so that the lamplight fell on it. Harry mastered his nausea and bent forward to look at the place Tom was indicating. There were two small marks, deeply indented. The area around them was bruised and swollen, darker even than the blackened face. "What do you make of it?" asked Tom. "Two bites close together, or the bite of an animal with two teeth, with fangs?" He gave Harry time to inspect the marks, then began to lower the body again to the table. Harry said, "But what sort of animal? In England, I mean." "That's what we have to find out. Mad Peter may have fallen on something, scraped against something. If he was subject to epileptic fits, he could have injured himself without being aware of it, and those marks may be quite unconnected with his death." "There's a way to find out," said Tom. "How?" Tom reached a bottle of brandy from the shelf behind him and poured 2 glasses. He handed one to Harry. "Have a look at your brother." Harry drank deeply. When he had steadied himself, his first impulse was to say no. The idea was appalling. Every instinct within him rebelled against such a monstrous notion. Then he caught Tom's straight, sure gaze on him, and realized what his friend had already been through on his behalf. He could not back down. "All right," he said hoarsely. They took Mad Peter's coffin back to the churchyard on a handcart, which Tom dragged from the littered yard at the back of the inn. Beside the wooden box were 2 large spades. The wheels of the cart squeaked over the cobbles, and in spite of all their efforts, there was an occasional thump as the coffin shifted. Mercifully, the rain continued, hammering out a tattoo on the roofs of the village and streaming noisily over the street towards the pond. Tom had hurriedly covered Peter's grave with boards. Now he dragged them aside, and the 2 men lowered the coffin into place again. Tom gave Harry one of the spades and took the other. "I'll fill this in. You start on your brother." Moisture streamed down Harry's neck as he dug. It was a mixture of sweat and rain, hot and cold at the same time, numbing him and reducing him to a wet pulp. The numbness was welcome. He didn't let himself think what he was doing. The desecration of the grave had to be carried out in mute obedience to a cause that would not bear sober analysis. At last, he had cleared the earth and revealed the lid of the coffin. Now, pausing, he almost lost heart. To look on what remained of his brother's face? He was not sure he could do it. Tom appeared at the graveside with a storm lantern. He held it out commandingly. Rain sparkled, falling past it into the dark hole. Harry pried the lid off the coffin and looked in. For a moment, it was as though he were peering down at a hideous twin to Mad Peter. The black puffiness, the twist of the mouth, the screwed-up eyes, the lineaments of intolerable agony. He retched. "Turn his head," said Tom inexorably. With a shaking hand, Harry got a grip on the head and turned it. Tom lowered the lantern. Well, there could be no mistake. The double mark was there, just as it had been on Mad Peter's neck. "That about proves it, doesn't it?" said Tom. "Ever see a mark like that before?" Harry shook his head. He was beyond speech. "I have," said Tom. "Once. In India. On a man bitten by a king cobra." Harry stared. It was impossible. Here in England, nothing could be more madly incredible. "It all fits," said Tom. "The blackening of the face, and that foaming at the mouth." "No!" cried Harry. He couldn't believe it, wouldn't believe it. He felt Tom's hand under his arm. Without knowing quite what was happening, he allowed himself to be helped up from the grave. Tom said, "You go on home and look after that wife of yours. We'll talk about it in the morning." When Harry groped blindly for his spade, Tom urged him away from the graveside. "I'll clear up here, don't worry, it'll all be left neat and tidy. Go on, go home before she gets upset and comes looking for you." Harry was not conscious of stumbling back to the cottage. There was a dull ache in his shoulders, but it meant nothing to him. The rain was blowing into his face so that he could not see his way, but his legs plodded automatically on, until he was at last aware of the cottage door immediately before him. He gasped for breath and drew himself up. He tried the door. It was locked, as he had said it must be. He knocked. "Who is it?" She was there. She was safe. "It's all right, darling." The key rattled in the lock, and the door was drawn open. Valerie dragged him inside and hugged him. The living reality of her was a wonderful thing after the dank despair of the graveyard. "You're soaked," she said when she drew away. "Come over by the fire and get those wet things off. The kettle's on. I'll make you a hot drink, then you can tell me all about it." Harry winced at the thought of having to explain his night's work. He moved to the fire and began to peel his coat from his wet shoulders. There was a small folded note propped on the mantelpiece against an old brass candlestick. "What's this?" "Oh, that was pushed under the door tonight," said Valerie. "It was addressed to you, so I didn't open it," she added demurely. Harry unfolded the note. It read, "I desperately need your help. Please come before it is too late. Anna Franklin." Perplexed, he held it out for Valerie to see. "Why should she turn to me?" "Who else has she to turn to?" asked Valerie. "But why a note? Why not come to the cottage and tell us what's wrong? Perhaps she did, and I didn't hear her." I might have been in the kitchen. Or perhaps she couldn't get away and had to send the note down by someone. Someone? Her father? Or that Malay? Valerie took the note from him and shook her head over it. Harry began to put his coat on again. The weight of it squeezed a chill damp into his shoulders. You can't go out again now, protested Valerie. The girl needs help. I can't just do nothing. Now can I? If you go, I'm coming too. No. He kissed her before she could argue and went quickly to the door. No, darling. The rain had stopped, but the ground was soggy underfoot. It slowed him down intolerably. An age seemed to pass before he reached the top of the hill, and the ache of his exertions in the churchyard began to pulse across his back and down his arms. Doggedly he went on. The house reared up before him, gaunt against the stormy night sky. Awesome. A sticky mass of wet leaves muffled Harry's footsteps as he trod cautiously along the side of the house. A frontal assault was out of the question. There must be some way to break in. At the end of the side wall, past a door which looked as though it had not been opened for years, a small window was slightly ajar. Harry clawed upwards to get a grip on it. He could only just get his fingertips over the sash, and when he pulled, there was no response. He prodded with his right foot against the wall, scraping about for a foothold. By ramming his toes hard against a ragged brick, he was able to push upwards and keep himself there for a few seconds. He put all his weight on the window and shook it. For a moment it would not budge. Then it let out a squeak and came down with a thud. Harry swayed back but held on. He waited. There was silence. He kneed himself up and over the window. Inside, he was in pitch darkness. He steadied himself against one wall and groped carefully out with his hands. As far as he could judge, he was in a narrow passage. He took a few tentative steps and blundered into no furniture or other obstacle. The faint light from the window began to pick out details. The passage was bare, without pictures on the walls. A few long strips of florid paper peeled away and curled to the floor. He walked warily on the bare boards. The place smelt damp, but there was a thin stream of warm air coming from the far end. He could make out the outlines of door panels. When he reached the door, he turned the handle very slowly. The door opened. Warmth was an engulfing wave now. He had half expected to come out into a room opening off the hall, but he must have lost his sense of direction. This room had a musty, enclosed feeling, and the smell of damp gave way to a thick, pungent animal stench. Harry stood quite still. All round him he was conscious of a stirring and twittering, a breathing and insistent fidget of life. He thought vividly of Mad Peter and of Charles. The marks on their necks came vividly back to his mind, as though a bright light had been beamed on them from the darkness. If this was the room in which Franklin kept monster snakes, Harry could not bear any longer to hear these scuttering sounds, and not see, not know. He fumbled in his pocket and took out a box of matches. One side of the box was damp, but after a couple of attempts he struck a match. The flames sputtered and swayed. He raised it above his head. The room was surrounded with cages from floor to ceiling, all of them with small padlocks. Inside the cages were small, furry animals of every description. Their eager eyes winked in the light, and threw back 100 reflecting gleams. Moles were humped at the backs of cages. Field mice ran suddenly round and round. A rabbit twitched its nose at Harry as he bent towards it. Not snakes then. But perhaps, he thought with a shock, food for snakes. Just as the light was burning towards his fingers, he saw two things. One was a farther door leading out of the room. The other was Katie, Valerie's little cat, also locked in a cage. He dropped the match and it went out. He groped towards the cage and tried to find the door, but it was padlocked like the others. Katie emitted a plaintive meow. There was nothing he could do right away. He picked his way towards the door and opened it. Beyond, there was still warmth and still darkness. He took a step forward, then another, a third, and he tripped over something and went sprawling. He lay quite still for a few seconds, then rolled over. Against the pale grey outline of a window, he saw the shape of a great cobra reared up, poised to strike. Harry braced himself, ready to kick himself away. But the creature did not move. He fumbled for his matches again, and struck one, still tense and ready to fling himself to either side. The rope-like coil of the king cobra remained motionless. The reptile was stuffed. Harry felt his heart pounding. He grinned wryly, and waited until the fear had subsided. Then he struck another match, and looked round the room. In the flickering light, it was threatening and macabre. He doubted whether it would have been much more attractive in daylight. Eastern curios were ranged all round the walls, surpassing even those in the library where he had sat with Franklin. The whole house must be crammed with weird dead objects, and with things that were frighteningly alive. Japanese armor, Chinese masks, shrunken heads, bizarre Javanese puppets and tables piled high with heavy reference books. The room and its occupants made a strange contrast to the adjoining room. There was another door. Harry went to it. He might get lost in a labyrinth, not knowing where to find the front of the house or the back. But he was driven on. Anna Franklin was a wretched prisoner in the middle of her father's fetid, perverse world. The sooner he took her away from here, the better. To his surprise, he found himself in the hall. A lamp burned on a low wick at the foot of the stairs. He was sure that someone was watching him, waiting for him. In a low voice he said, "Anna." There was no reply. Anna. He did not dare to raise his voice too much. From the top of the stairs came a faint rustle, the suspicion of a creaking of woodwork. Harry looked up. Shadows clung to the banisters, but there was a darker shadow where a door stood open, a shadow which diminished as the door was gently closed. Harry started up the stairs. The sensation of someone waiting grew stronger. In his head, there was the sound of Anna calling to him. He stopped in front of the door. In spite of the suffocating warmth of the house, he felt cold. His damp clothes clung to him. He put his hand out to the door. It opened at a touch. "Anna." He thought he heard a long sigh. The darkness beyond the door was lightened. The moon must have come out from behind the clouds and was shining into the room or corridor beyond. Harry strode forward. The door at once closed behind him. He saw the moonlight spilling across the floor. He turned and saw it welling up the surface of the closed door, and over the woman who stood there. Woman? It was Anna. That much he saw even when he could not believe what he was seeing. It was Anna, but not the reserved, beautiful girl he had met. Her hair was drawn back into a slimy mane, so tightly pressed against her head that it seemed almost to sink into the flesh and become part of it. Her head had narrowed, her jaw thrust forward, and the exquisite skin was scaly and iridescent. She opened her mouth, and a forked tongue flickered in a jet of hissing breath. Harry let out a cry. The snake's head, that was still, grotesquely, a woman's head struck forward. He fell sideways. The venomous fangs sank into the collar of his coat, missing by an inch the spot on his neck for which they had been aimed. Pain stabbed into his shoulder. The contact had been brief but poisonous. He felt a raging fire begin to spread through him. The force of the attack had carried the writhing snake woman forward. She swayed and coiled in the middle of the narrow space, twisting round in a hissing frenzy. Harry threw himself at the door and tugged it open. The staircase fell away before him into a blurred infinity. He went down it without knowing what he was doing. His left hand groped for the rail, but he was not conscious of touching it. Conscious only of the agony that could not get any more terrifying and yet impossibly got worse, until it screamed through his veins. Or was he the one who was screaming? Was it his voice that he heard, or only the howling of his blood? His feet reached the floor of the hall, and he went reeling on towards the door. The world spun around him, yet his feet carried him on, lurching out into the cold air. The shock of the night chill saved him from complete collapse. He took a deep breath, and the rasp of it against his throat hurt. It steadied him. He stumbled on, not seeing but finding his way, in a haze of pain down through the plantation, and down the slope to the cottage. He knew nothing of it. Only a blind animal instinct drove him on. When he crashed, sobbing, against the door of the cottage, he was no longer Harry Spaulding but a racked victim in its death throes. An inhuman thing without personality. and with no thought but that of pain, unbearable pain. To give up, to let the pain take over, to be done with it. The door opened and he collapsed across the threshold. A woman was screaming in his ear. Her hands were on his shoulders trying to lift him. And the agony was worse. "Knife!" He heard a harsh voice saying. "Sharp knife." It was his own unrecognizable voice. Some part of him that was still human struggled to the surface and fought for the survival of a puny self through a bedlam of anguish. "Cut it!" He was tearing at his shoulder, ripping the material away to expose the wound. In God's name. He saw the knife and saw Valerie's face, and saw that she was trembling, and that if she couldn't bring herself to do it then he would die. Cut it deep. His voice rose to a shriek. Cut deep. And let the poison out. Valerie bent over him. Her face swam away into a red haze. Even through the agony that he had thought was insuperable, he felt another, more vicious agony, as though the venomous fangs had struck again, and struck, this time, deeply and decisively. He arched with pain. There was a great gulf opening beneath him, and at last he surrendered and let himself go down in a dizzying, interminable fall. He had expected to disappear forever into the abyss. There should have been blackness, nothingness, but he swam in a sea of blood, trying to free his head, so that he could wipe the red smears from his eyes and see, and a great heart hammered within the sea, deafening him, so that every muscle in his body twitched in time. Anna. She rose, a serpentine monstrosity, from the scarlet ocean, her head poised over him. The features were distorted so that she had ceased to be Anna and was a creature of dark legend, something which could never be human again. The forked tongue flashed in and out as though in anticipation, and the venom gleamed on the colossal fangs. Something cool was wiped slowly across his forehead. For a fraction of a second, his eyes cleared, and he seemed to see Valerie bending over him with a damp cloth in her hand. Then he was falling again, and the snake was lashing and hissing around him once more. He had meant to protect Anna. He had wanted, somewhere an age ago, to save Anna from the death that slithered and struck in the hot, fetid house of her mad father. It hadn't worked. Anna. The snake. She had been struck, swallowed up, transformed. She wasn't Anna. Couldn't be. The nightmare seethed in his veins and his mind. Anna, he groaned despairingly. 9. By dawn, Harry had ceased to thrash around on the bed, and was sleeping heavily, apart from an occasional jolt which shook his entire body. Valerie sat by his bedside, feeling utterly spent, but thankful that the worst was over. His abrupt appeals, the insistence of his calls to Anna, had ceased now, but they, more than anything, disturbed her. She wondered if he had reached Anna, or if he had been too late. Or was the girl now a prisoner? The way barred by some unspeakable horror. Harry must have tried to fight his way through, and must have been thrown back. Was it too late now to save Anna? She could not go down to the village for help. She was unwilling to leave Harry. And there was probably little help to be expected from that quarter anyway. The villagers preferred to remain behind closed doors. If they heard what had happened to Harry, they would nod sagely, put shutters across their windows, and not venture out into the open at all. As the daylight strengthened in the bedroom, Harry murmured in his sleep again, "Anna?" There was a sharp knock at the door downstairs. Valerie tensed. It came again, more insistent this time. She realized that she felt, deep down, much as the villagers must feel. She was reluctant to open the door, to let anyone or anything in. She opened the tiny window of the bedroom and leaned out. Tom Bailey heard the squeak of the catch, and stood back on the path so that she could see him. He said, "I was wondering if Mr. Spaulding, I'll come down and let you in." When he came into the sitting room she gave him no time to speak, but directed him towards the stairs. Tom plodded up ahead of her. She heard his gasp when he saw Harry stretched out, unconscious in what was obviously no ordinary sleep. She came into the room behind him and went round the bed. Gently she turned Harry's head and took the dressing off the ugly black wound on his shoulder. Tom bent over it and stared. Then he said, When did he go up there? Up there? To the house, last night. But how did you know? Thought as much, Tom growled. But what made him go? A note was pushed under the door while he was out with you. It's downstairs. I'll go and... Never mind. What did it say? It was from Anna Franklin. She asked for help. Help? What kind of help? Valerie realized how elusive it all was, how very little they had to go on. We can only guess, she said lamely. From her father, though, we're pretty sure of that. She's in danger. The thought of Anna's appeal to her came back, and with it the memory of Anna's tragic eyes. Tom, I ought to go to her. She went to the stairs and hurried down. Tom was hard on her heels. When she turned to take her coat down from its peg, he blocked her way. Now, Mrs. Spaulding, you'll do no such thing. You see what happened to your husband, and it's your job to look after him, and you won't do that if you wear yourself out. Dashing off up to that house won't do no one any good. He was respectful but firm as he took her arm and steered her towards a chair. You'll sit down and relax for 5 minutes. And perhaps you've got a kettle I could be putting on. The strain of the hideous night hours had been greater than she thought. When she allowed herself to be persuaded to sit in the armchair, the strength fled from her legs and arms, and she went quite limp. Tom's burly, reassuring presence enabled her to relax for the first time. He was used to looking after himself and after his inn, and his movements as he made her a drink and set out cups and saucers on the table were trim and economical. When she was sipping the strong brew of tea he had made, he said, I'd best be getting back to open the doors and see to my customers. But you'll be all right, won't you? Valerie nodded. It was all she could bring herself to do. I'll see if I can get one of the lads to take a note into town, Tom went on thoughtfully. Clem should be going in today, and maybe he'll carry a message to the doctor. Not that they're usually in any hurry to come all the way out of town to this place, but I'll do what I can. And meanwhile, I reckon Mr. Spaulding isn't going to come to any harm. Provided you look after him properly. Valerie put her cup down. A terrible lassitude was seeping into her limbs and her mind. Drowsily she said, Tom, you've put something in this tea, haven't you? He smiled and patted a bulge in his jacket pocket. It had the shape of a flask. Good for you, he said. He pushed a small stool forward and lifted her feet so that they rested on it. Now, just you stay there. If I can get back later today, I will, and if I can get the doctor up, I'll bring him with me. She wanted to get up to see him to the door, but he waved her down, and she was glad to obey. When he had gone, she felt obscurely that she ought to go upstairs, ought to sit by Harry, ought to do so many things, wash the teacups, make a meal. No, not yet, but later she would have to go up and see Harry. Sleep. The cottage and the fields around it were still. She drowsed. A few birds sang in a nearby tree, but otherwise there was nothing. Valerie's head nodded. She gave up to the demands of her weariness and slept. When she awoke, it was dusk. She couldn't believe it. The hours had slipped by, and daylight had escaped over the crown of the hill. There was a creak from the stove. The fire had almost gone out. Hastily she made it up again, and then went upstairs to see that Harry was all right. He was sleeping soundly and normally now. He was safe. They were both safe in their snug little refuge. Safe? Could anyone be truly safe, so long as that indefinable menace continued to exist in the Franklin house? She thought of Anna again, and this time, she came to a decision. Darkness was closing in swiftly as she made her way up the slope. She went warily as she approached the trees. Harry had been struck down, but she did not know where it had happened. In that grim house, or out here in the overgrown grounds. She must take no chances. She avoided the front of the house and clung to the side wall. A window was open at the end. It must have been through here that Harry got in. She had no idea if he had also escaped this way. Valerie scrambled up and swung precariously over the window into a narrow passage. A door at the end of it stood wide open, and in the twilight she could see the faint gleam of wire bars. When she slid stealthily into the room, she was confronted by rows and rows of small cages, all of them empty, yet there was still a warm, oppressive smell, as though the cages had only recently been populated. She went on. Another door was ajar, and there was a line of brighter light down it. Valerie tried to see through, but could catch only a glimpse of a narrow segment of the room beyond. An ivory figurine grinned sightlessly back at her from a shelf. With infinite care she prodded the door open, waiting to dodge back if anyone should speak. The back of a tall chair edged into view. A hand lay on the arm of the chair. As she watched, it moved. Valerie froze. She saw Franklin push himself up from the chair and stand for a moment in the center of the room. His shoulders were sagging, and he seemed unable to move any farther. Then he walked forward like a man in a trance and bent over something which was out of Valerie's range of vision. When he stepped back, he was holding a wicked-looking curved sword. He shook himself into life, turned, and strode out of sight. There was the sound of a door opening and shutting. Valerie edged into the room. A suit of Japanese armor hung on a frame seemed to guard the farther door. She went past it, opened the door, and looked out into the hall. It was deserted. She advanced to the foot of the stairs and looked up. If Franklin had gone up to his daughter with that murderous sword, terror clamped down between Valerie's shoulders. But she was determined to see this through. The stairs were wide, the lamps were burning. She could turn and flee if she had to. But now she resolutely went up to the landing. There were too many doors. She didn't know which to choose, could not even begin to guess what lay behind any of them. She turned the knob of the nearest and looked into a small bedroom. There was nobody there. The next one revealed the bare boards of a narrow passage, leading apparently nowhere. The third one opened into another bedroom. It had a musky, slightly cloying smell. A humped shape on the bed lay quite still in the faint light from the window. Valerie murmured, "Anna?" Still, it did not stir. She went in, one step at a time, tense and ready to jump aside or turn and run. When she reached the bedside, she found herself looking down at Anna's naked body. It lay on top of the counterpane, head sunk in a pillow, utterly still. Too late. Anna did not move, did not breathe. It was too late to save her. Whatever Franklin had planned for his daughter had been done. Valerie leaned over the body and put out a hand to touch it. She had expected to feel cold flesh, or perhaps flesh still warm, only newly dead. Instead, the body yielded to her touch. There was no substance to it. Valerie almost overbalanced, and all her weight went down upon her hand. It pushed its way hideously down onto the skin, and the skin crumpled and distorted. The head was not, as she had thought, buried in a pillow. There was no head. The hollow shell flattened out on the bed, and Valerie fell back with a whimper of nausea. This was not Anna, yet it had been the shape and likeness of a beautiful young woman. The skin formed into a human semblance but now shed. Shed? As a snake sheds its skin. Valerie stumbled towards the door. She had lost all sense of caution. She moaned to herself as she blundered down the stairs. If anyone had barred her way to the front door, there would have been no possible escape. But nobody appeared. She stopped in the hall and looked wildly round. A door below the stairs was open. Light filtered from below up a winding flight of stone steps. Valerie went to the door and hesitated. A faint whispering seemed to come up the stairwell, a whispering made up of pathetic little squeaks, and even, she thought, the mewing of a cat. She went slowly down. The stairs led into a cellar. In the far wall was an arch, through which a faint steam drifted across the cellar. It had a sulphurous smell, probably the breath of one of the county's subterranean streams and wells. Huddled in cages against the cellar walls were mice and rats, a quivering rabbit, and her own Katie. Valerie stared incredulously. Then she heard the sound of a groan from the space beyond the cellar. She tiptoed across the damp flagstones of the floor and peered through the arch. The surface of the well seethed gently in the middle of a small cavern. Against one ragged rocky wall, a shape was huddled beneath a blanket. A lantern had been placed beside it, its yellow glow casting fantastic shadows and dancing apparitions through the wisps of sulphurous steam. Franklin was a gaunt silhouette, leaning on the sword he had taken from his collection. He might have been brooding here for an age, keeping a vigil, or willing himself to some terrible deed. As Valerie watched, Franklin stooped, and with one brusque movement threw the blanket aside. Anna lay there, her body shone with a green scaly brightness. She stirred. A ripple ran down her body, and her head twisted to show the eyes slanting back into the skull. Franklin raised the sword above his head. Valerie tried to scream, but no sound would come. The sword slashed down with savage force. There was a scream. Not Anna's, and not Valerie's. It came from the cellar, and was like the violent howl of a madman, stabbing out towards Franklin. It was enough to deflect his aim, so that the blade missed Anna by an inch. Valerie lurched to one side. A lithe body sprang past her with demoniacal force. It was the Malay, carrying an oil lamp, and swinging it as though it were a weapon. He launched himself at Franklin. The two men met, the clash of the impact throwing them towards the bubbling pool. Franklin tried to lift the sword again, but the Malay waved the lamp in his face. Franklin ducked and lashed out. The lamp went flying. The Malay screamed, and went on screaming like some primitive warrior, urging himself onto new feats of savagery. He clawed, bit, kicked, and Franklin buckled before the onslaught. Franklin was the bigger man, but the Malay was possessed by a spirit of destruction. A great hierarchy of vengeful gods stood behind him and gave him strength. He went for Franklin's eyes, yelling hideous sounds that were not words but meaningless curses. They rocked on the edge of the terrible pool, and Franklin at last got a grip on the stabbing, kicking little man. There was a moment when they held on to each other and couldn't move, their feet set, their legs and arms stiff, their bodies locked. And then the Malay was thrown clear, toppling on the edge of the sulfur pool and falling. There was one heart-stopping scream of fear, and then the little man had gone, lost forever beneath the simmering surface. The steam billowed out. At the same time, there was a gout of flame which irradiated the whole cavern. A greedy tongue of fire licked across the rocky floor. The lamp which the Malay had swung at Franklin was on its side, spilling a deadly blaze out into the confined space. Fumes clutched at Valerie's throat. She coughed, and in a panic, turned back towards the stone steps. Franklin cried something after her. She raced for the staircase, and heard him behind her. Fear drove her at a mad pace up the steps and out into the hall. She was clawing at the massive bolts on the front door when his arm came round her throat and drew her back. "No," he said in an impossibly level, reasonable voice. "Oh, dear, no. I'm sorry, but really—" Valerie tried to fight free. He did not fight back. He simply held on to her with a grip that could not be loosened, and she felt herself being drawn towards that room in which he and Harry had talked. It was a lifetime ago. Franklin closed the door behind them and then released her. "I'm sorry," he said again. She thought of the flames licking across the cellar and had a picture of them making their way up the stairs, spreading and devouring. She cried, "We've got to—" "Sit down," he said mildly. It was absurd. The domineering, sour-visaged Dr. Franklin had grown gentle and courteous. He had the air of a man quietly determined to maintain a front of decency and sweet reason, no matter what hideous terrors exploded around him. "The fire," she said, trying to wave him away from the door. "The fire? Those animals down there? And Anna?" "Anna," he said, as though an echo had been struck. He put his head on one side, relishing it. Then the grief in his face was like a rush of blood. It thrust Valerie backwards like a physical force. "You know what you saw down there?" he said. "That vile thing. You know it was my daughter?" "Anna," she said weakly, still not believing. "Yes. But not the Anna you know. Not the lovely girl who... His voice broke. He was the man with bowed shoulders she had seen preparing to take the Japanese sword and do what he at last accepted had to be done. Not that girl, Mrs. Spaulding. A cruel parody, a loathsome thing, using her body. She has been possessed by a devil. We don't use such words nowadays, do we? But I say it was a devil. You saw her with your own eyes. You saw her, my daughter, and, oh my God, he sagged, and was on the verge of collapse. In spite of herself, Valerie held out her arms, and when he just failed to fall forward into them, she warily touched his elbow and guided him to a chair. He looked, bewildered, round the shelves which held books and ornaments, the grinning faces and the bestial faces and the tranquil faces of an alien antiquity. Slowly, ruminatively, as though there were all the time in the world, he said, "Her mother died in giving her life. She was my dearest possession, my only happiness. And they knew it, they knew it. They knew that this was the way to punish me." Valerie sank on her knees before him. Mrs. Spaulding, I am a doctor of theology. My particular study has been the primitive religions of the Far East. I have traveled, India, Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and I have seen many things they wished me not to see. I have penetrated the deepest jungles, the foulest swamps, and everywhere I went, Anna was always with me, always at my side, never complaining, always cheerful, always devoted. Franklin shrank into his chair, reaching out into memory, and plucking visions from the past into the present. There was one religious cult which kept evading me. Like the leopard people of Africa, this was a secret society which guarded its secrets jealously, fanatically. The Orang Sancto, the snake people. You won't have heard of them, Mrs. Spaulding. Very few people have, outside Borneo. And there they would never dare speak of it for fear the outside world might discover their secrets. I set myself the goal of finding out. I would not be warned, and I would not be held back. It took a long time and a great deal of patience, but I managed it, and I returned to Singapore to write up my investigations. A few weeks later, Anna disappeared. He was talking hypnotically, not so much to Valerie as to himself, as though picking his way over a wilderness of things which had happened, but ought not to have happened, which he would change if he were given the gift of his time over again. It happens too often in Malaya, he said, listening to his own words and waiting for significant resonances. I was angry, I was frightened. But I awaited the usual ransom note from bandits. Of course I would pay. My colleagues calmed me. Money, they assured me, would solve everything, and there was no need for me to worry about Anna's safety. And then, without warning, Anna was returned. 3 weeks later she was restored to me. She was unhurt and had no memory of what had happened to her. And then it all started. His eyes widened. He put his hands on the arms of the chair and seemed to be on the verge of pushing himself up, as she had once before seen him get to his feet. But he stayed where he was. They had their revenge, he said in a dull, obsessed tone. Anna was one of them. As soon as I realized what had happened, I got her as far away from their sphere of influence as possible. I brought her here in the hope that it would weaken their hold, and because the sulfur streams could provide warmth for the house in winter. She needed the warmth. You see, he shuddered almost as the creature in the cellar had shuddered, twisting from side to side. Every winter Anna sheds her skin. She goes into a deep sleep. The cold would kill her. Yes. Valerie nodded meaninglessly. The only sense in all this was the perverted logic of nightmare, in which all things were plausible. Yes. It was useless, said Franklin. They followed me. I was not allowed a moment's peace. But surely... She will die now, he said. It is probably better so. No. Valerie got to her feet and went towards the door. All of us, Anna, yourself and me, if we... She had no idea what solution she was going to offer, and in any case, Franklin gave her no time to finish. He sprang into sudden life, and barred her way to the door. You must stay here, Mrs. Spaulding. But, surely she could smell smoke. Surely the flames must by now be raging through the cellar. The place is on fire. Fire? Said Franklin vaguely. He thought about this, then nodded. Yes, it will keep her warm. Dear Anna, poor Anna, it will warm her. She realized that his mind had gone. The acceptance in his features, so different from the bleakness of his anger, was the acceptance of one who no longer had any arguments to propound or confute. He was mad. He could take no more. As though to emphasize his indifference, he turned away and began to collect some of the smaller curios from his shelves. lining them up on a table in the middle of the room. Valerie waited until he was selecting pieces from a shelf in the far corner, and dashed for the door. He was too quick for her. His hand closed on hers as she grabbed for the doorknob. "Mrs. Spaulding." He sounded genuinely pained. "I did tell you that you must stay. Didn't I? I'm sure I did. You can't leave yet." He turned the key in the door and pocketed it. Valerie kept a grip on herself. She mustn't panic and she mustn't enrage him. Now he was mild and slow, a quite changed Franklin, but he might turn from a gentle ruminative madness to one of towering rage. If she were to escape, she must plan and be patient and not be frightened. Yet while he plodded around the room, taking down this piece and that, nodding philosophically over the little collection he was amassing on the table, the fire must be sweeping through the cellars. From a drawer, he took a large leather bag and tipped his treasures into it. Smiling affably, he said, "I'm afraid I shall have to leave you locked in." "You can't. You have nothing to fear." The words were soothing, but she knew that there was no significance in them. He was not concerned with her other than as a nuisance to be avoided as far as possible, an interfering woman to be placated and then left. He was making vague noises at her as he would have made them to a dog, wanting only to be out of the house and off into the night of forgetfulness. "Your husband," he said cheerfully, "is sure to come looking for you soon." He took out the key, let himself out, and closed the door behind him. She heard the key rasp in the lock, but could not tell whether he had taken it away with him. And then she heard another sound. There were no footsteps going away from the door, nothing. Only a muffled sigh. And then Franklin said, "Anna?" And he said it again. And even through the door Valerie heard the wild venomous hiss. And again Anna's name on her father's lips, but this time screamed. And screamed again. Then the gentlest of thuds against the door, and a sliding, slithering sound. And silence. Until the key turned in the lock again, to set. The handle of the door turned slowly. Valerie watched it, wanting to turn and run, but to where? The door opened. Valerie backed away a pace and jarred against the table. She steadied herself and still could not take her eyes off the door. Anna came in. It was a beautiful face and a deadly face. The movements of the slim, splendid body were smooth and sinuous, almost musical in their unbroken flow, smooth and delicate and savage. Valerie groped round the table. Her hand touched the back of her chair, and she used it to guide her away towards one wall. Her shoulder came up sharply against one of the shelves, and a fragile piece of porcelain rang a clear, gentle note. Anna's mouth opened. She appeared to be smiling. Her lips drew back, and her forked tongue flashed and danced its mad, derisive little dance. Valerie said helplessly, "Anna, if we can get out of here, if we can, we—" Anna slid round the table and came on, her head stabbing and seeking, her fangs bared. There was a sudden thunderous knocking at the front door. Valerie's voice surged up like a wild thing from her strangled throat. "Here," she was yelling, "here! Help me! In here!" Anna bent, straightened, and lashed out like a broken spring. Her head plunged, she hissed, and there was a sharp, searing pain in Valerie's throat. She cried out once, then fell, and was only dimly aware of Anna recoiling and slithering, writhing away across the room. At the same time, there was the crash of glass. One of the windows showered inwards. Cool air blew across Valerie's face as she tried to get up to her knees. "Cold!" cried a mournful, wailing voice. It was Anna, twisting away in a contortion of pain. So cold. Outside the room, there was a splintering sound. Then the door rocked as someone smashed a shoulder against it. "Valerie, in here," she croaked desperately. The door shuddered again. Another few panes of glass tinkled to the floor, and Tom Bailey was framed in the jagged outline of the broken window. His way was blocked by iron bars on the inside. "Cold," moaned Anna. She shrank in on herself. As Tom kicked more glass out of the way and the wind howled in, she whipped into a coil and sank to the floor. The door gave way. Harry stumbled in and threw himself down beside Valerie. "My darling." There was a pain in her shoulder, but it wasn't spreading. Her head was clear. She struggled up. Harry, I'm not hurt. Why, I'm not hurt. Get her out, before it's too late, Tom bellowed from the window. Smoke billowed in through the door from the hall. Harry took Valerie's hand, and together they walked into the acrid fumes. From below, there was a mad shrieking and caterwauling. A few little furry creatures scuttered up from the cellar. The cage doors must have sprung open. But there must be others. There was Katie. Valerie said, "I've got to go down." The smoke stung her throat and made her eyes stream. Blindly she groped her way against a rising wave of heat. Flames licked out across the cellar as she reached it, and Harry was bellowing in her ear. She paid no attention. Maddened, he groped out through the choking fumes, and she heard his hands smack into a cage door. He understood at once. They wrenched doors open, and heard maddened little animals leap out and squeal away. She tore at one cage after another until Katie's anguished screeches drew her closer. Then she opened the door and grabbed the cat. "All right?" Harry was shouting. "All right. We've got to go." They were coughing and weeping. Fire belched in a great fury after them as they fumbled their way back up the steps. Katie dug claws into Valerie's arm, but she was hardly aware of them. In the unholy light, they saw Franklin's body slumped beside the door of his sanctum. The mouth was twisted into a grimace. Harry grunted as though recognizing this, and pulled Valerie along with him. "He's gone," he said. "Gone." Black smoke rolled over the blackening, distorted features. Tom was waiting impatiently at the front door. "Hurry. The whole building could go up any minute." They tripped over the weeds, floundered away from the house towards the plantation, and stopped in the shade of the trees. There was little to be seen. A deep, incongruously inviting glow burned red beyond 2 or 3 of the windows. But at first there was no sound, and no other indication of anything wrong. Then there was a faint, ominous creaking. A humming sound swelled into a roaring, crackling pulsation. One of the windows reddened too violently to be welcoming, and at last a great flame licked out into the night. Valerie clutched Harry's hand. "How did you know? What made you come?" "You can thank Tom for that," said Harry grimly. "He came to see you and report, and you weren't there. And I was awake, wondering where you'd got to." The windows were all ablaze with horrifying speed. The dark hulk of the house became bright. Flames twisted in the wind like the twisting shape of Anna. The cold that had struck her down gave way to a scorching heat that would swallow up the last traces of her and her father. Instinctively, Valerie strained forward as though to hurl herself back into the house. But there would be no rescue missions. There was no point in rescuing that poor accursed creature. Harry held firm, and the 3 of them watched as smoke and flame reached up towards the night sky. Fire was purifying the neighborhood. The terrible spell would be burnt away. "What I can't understand," said Valerie in a subdued voice almost drowned by the roaring inferno, "is why I'm not hurt. She struck me, but there hasn't been any effect." "She killed her father," said Harry. "Yes, but—" "A snake can't strike twice in that time," said Tom. "Not to do any damage, that is." Valerie stared into the mounting flames, until her eyes ached. Then she turned away, and Harry's firm hand on her arm guided her back towards the cottage. The landscape was illuminated by the blaze. Tomorrow she would study it in sunlight. Tomorrow and all the days after that, she would learn to know the land from which at last a curse had been lifted. "It's all over now," said Tom thankfully, echoing her thoughts as he followed them down the slope.